started off like any other camping trip. I was looking for a quiet weekend, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. There's something peaceful about the woods. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the smell of pine in the air, the feeling of being far removed from everything. It's a getaway I always look forward to, especially after a tough few months at work. I set up camp near a small lake, the kind that reflects the sky so perfectly you almost can't tell where the water ends and the air begins. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the land. I made a fire, not a big one, just enough to keep the chill away as night slowly crept in. The first few hours passed without anything unusual happening. I sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and enjoying the stillness of the night. The sound of the crackling fire was almost hypnotic. I looked around at the trees, the thick forest that surrounded me, and it was hard to believe that just a few hours earlier, this place had been full of life. Now, the woods felt different, quiet in a way that was almost unnatural. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet I was used to. It was like the whole forest had gone still, waiting for something. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just my imagination. It had been a long drive to get to the campsite, and I was probably just overtired. I grabbed my flashlight and took a walk around the perimeter of my camp, checking that everything was secure. The last thing I wanted was for some animal to get into my food. As I walked, I noticed something odd. A small patch of ground near the lake was disturbed. It looked like something had been dragged through the dirt, a narrow, deep gouge that seemed out of place. It was strange. No animal in the area that I knew of would leave such a mark, and it wasn't the kind of damage caused by a person either. I decided to investigate, but after a quick scan of the area, I couldn't find anything that would explain it. I chalked it up to some kind of weird natural occurrence, something I couldn't quite explain but wasn't worth worrying about. I went back to camp, stoking the fire a little higher to shake off the chill creeping in. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't a fear I could put my finger on. It was more of an unease, an instinctive pull at the back of my mind that told me to stay alert. I had been camping enough to know that the woods were unpredictable, but this felt different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The forest seemed to be alive with the sound of wind, but the trees weren't moving in the way they should. It was almost like they were holding their breath, waiting. I couldn't help but glance around, half expecting something to jump out from the darkness. As the night wore on, the sense of unease grew stronger. Every time I heard a twig snap, my head jerked toward the sound. Every rustle in the bushes made my heart race. But there was nothing there. No wild animal, no sign of movement, just the shadows of the trees and the flickering light of the fire. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but at some point, I decided to head to my tent. The fire was burning low, the night getting colder, and I was ready to turn in. But as I crawled into the tent and zipped it up, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of an animal, deep in the woods, maybe just beyond my camp. I froze. It wasn't the kind of growl you'd expect from a bear or a mountain lion. It was almost too deliberate. It didn't sound like it was coming from a typical predator. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the sound didn't come again. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a wild animal, some sort of wolf or coyote. But then again, there wasn't supposed to be anything like that around here. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it around the camp. I couldn't see anything. No eyes gleaming back at me from the darkness. No movement in the trees. Still, the unease didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger. I decided to stay inside the tent, hoping whatever it was would just leave. But the sound of something moving around outside kept me awake. The occasional snap of a twig, the sound of something brushing against the tent. I tried to convince myself it was just a raccoon or a deer, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Felt too intentional, too close. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. The next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a noise. Louder now, more urgent. Something was pacing outside my tent. I could hear it clearly now, heavy footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for the knife I kept by my side, my fingers brushing the handle as I lay still, listening. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped, and then silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, so thick you could feel it. It was unnerving. I was terrified. The next few minutes felt like hours. I stayed still, barely moving, listening for any signs of movement. But there was nothing except the beating of my own heart. Then, suddenly, the silence was broken. A branch snapped in the distance, followed by a strange sound. A hoarse, throaty breathing that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't like any animal I had ever heard before. The kind of breath that sounded almost human, yet twisted and wrong. My grip tightened on the knife, but my mind was racing. I didn't know what to do. There was no way I could run in the dark, no way I could fight whatever it was. I had to stay calm. I had to think. Then, the breathing stopped, and the sound of footsteps began again, this time moving away from the tent. Slowly, cautiously. It was like whatever it was knew I was still there, watching, waiting. I waited in silence, the minutes stretching on, hoping, praying that whatever it was would just leave. Eventually, the sound faded into the distance, and the forest returned to its eerie silence. I didn't move for what felt like hours. I stayed in the tent, wide awake, listening for any sound, any sign of danger. But nothing came. Finally, the first light of dawn broke through the trees. I waited for the sun to rise higher, just in case whatever it was still out there. When I felt it was safe enough, I slowly crawled out of the tent, keeping my eyes on the trees, on the dark shadows that loomed just beyond the clearing. I quickly packed up my things, moving with urgency but trying not to make too much noise. The last thing I wanted was to draw attention. But as I finished packing up, something caught my eye. It was a strange mark on the ground, a deep gouge in the dirt, similar to the one I had seen the day before, but this one was fresh, and it led right up to the edge of my tent. That was enough. I didn't need any more signs. I didn't want to stay another minute. I grabbed my gear and started the hike back to my car, moving as quickly as I could without panicking. The woods around me felt different now. Not peaceful or calming, but threatening, as if something was still watching, waiting for me to slip up. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. As I loaded my gear into the car, I looked back one last time at the woods, the place where I had planned to find peace. But now it just felt wrong, haunted by something I couldn't explain. I drove home that day, my mind still racing. Whatever had happened out there, I was glad to be away from it. Maybe it was just an animal, maybe it wasn't, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that spot, not ever again. And that's how I learned the hard way. Sometimes the woods hold secrets, things you're better off never discovering. You can't always trust what you hear in the silence, and some things you just don't want to know. I had always loved the outdoors, hiking, camping, anything that kept me in the wild, away from the noise and distractions of the city. That's why when I heard about this hidden campsite in the woods near the base of a mountain, I couldn't resist the idea of going there alone. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful spot, far away from the usual crowded camping grounds. I wanted some time to myself, to clear my head and reconnect with nature. Little did I know that this decision would be one I would regret. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and all the essentials. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because, honestly, I thought it was just going to be another solo trip that I would enjoy. The weather was perfect when I set off. The sun was shining, and the air was crisp and fresh. The drive was long, but the view along the way made it worth it. As I passed by thick forests, winding rivers, and open fields, it felt like I was venturing into a new world. I arrived at the trailhead just before noon. The area was quiet, with no other cars parked in the lot, which made me feel a bit isolated, but I didn't mind. I wanted solitude. The trail itself was a narrow path that led into the dense woods, and I started walking, following the markers along the way. The first hour was nothing out of the ordinary. The trees towered over me, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Birds were chirping, and there was the occasional rustling in the underbrush, but nothing that made me uneasy. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail. The clearing where the campsite was located was just as described: quiet, serene, and isolated. There was a small stream nearby, and a few flat areas perfect for setting up my tent. I wasted no time and began preparing my camp. The ground was soft underfoot, covered with moss and fallen leaves. I found a spot just next to the stream, where I could hear the water trickling over rocks. It was peaceful, and I felt like I was in my own little world. As I set up my tent and unpacked my gear, the sound of the stream and the rustling leaves was the only background noise. The air was getting cooler, but the firewood I gathered earlier would be enough to keep me warm for the night. By the time the sun had set, the sky was filled with stars, and the only light was from my campfire. I sat back, staring into the flames, lost in thought. I had always loved the crackling sound of a campfire. It felt like the fire was alive, breathing, and moving. But as the night grew deeper, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint at first, just a vague sense of unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was the silence. Aside from the occasional gust of wind through the trees, the usual nighttime sounds of animals and insects were absent. I shook it off, thinking it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I spent the next few hours cooking my dinner and eating by the fire. The meal was nothing fancy, just some freeze-dried food and a hot drink. As I finished eating, I threw a few more logs onto the fire and watched the flames dance. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable. A rustling sound, not from the trees, but from the brush behind me. I turned, half expecting to see a deer or some other animal, but there was nothing. I shrugged it off and convinced myself that it was just the wind or some animal passing through. But as the night grew darker, the sounds became more frequent. The rustling, the snapping of twigs, the low thud of something moving in the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, my heart beginning to race. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees and the ground. The light fell on nothing but shadows. Still, the sounds continued. It was like something was moving around my campsite, staying just out of sight. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox. I tried to push the growing sense of dread out of my mind and sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Hours passed, and I eventually went into the tent, hoping sleep would calm my nerves. But sleep didn't come. I lay awake, listening to the sounds outside. The rustling grew louder, closer. Then the unmistakable sound of someone moving through the camp. My heart raced as I slowly reached for the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of boots crunching on the forest floor. I held my breath, trying to listen carefully. There was no mistaking it. Someone was out there, moving around, but they weren't making any attempt to be quiet. I felt trapped. The thought of going outside to confront whoever or whatever was out there sent a chill through me. I could hear them getting closer, circling my tent, as if they were trying to figure out my position. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone else who had decided to camp in this isolated spot? Or was it someone more dangerous? The moments stretched on. The tent felt smaller, the air thicker. I tried to calm my breathing, but I was frozen with fear. The sounds stopped for a while, and the silence that followed was deafening. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything that would give me a clue about what was going on. Then, a voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed in the distance. It wasn't loud enough for me to make out words, but it was there, a whisper or perhaps a shout, coming from the direction of the stream. I couldn't stay in the tent any longer. I needed to get out, but I was terrified. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the door, poking my head out just enough to scan the campsite. The fire was still burning, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. The rustling in the bushes had stopped, and the eerie silence returned. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Slowly, I stepped out of the tent and crept toward the fire, my flashlight casting long shadows on the ground. I shined the light in the direction of the stream, but there was nothing. No sign of movement, no footprints, no animals. Just the water flowing calmly over the rocks. For a long time, I just stood there listening, waiting. Eventually, I decided it was safe to return to the tent, but the sense of unease never left me. Couldn't sleep. The hours dragged on, and I kept my flashlight on, scanning the area outside. The sounds came and went, but nothing appeared. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my gear quickly, heart pounding the entire time. As I hiked back down the trail, the sounds of the forest felt different, almost welcoming compared to the tense, oppressive silence of the night. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, where my car was parked, and even then, I felt like I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't tell anyone about what happened at that campsite. Maybe they wouldn't believe me, or maybe I just didn't want to admit how close I had come to something that felt wrong. Whatever it was enough to make me never want to camp alone again. The woods may seem peaceful at first, but sometimes there's something out there, something that doesn't want you to stay. It had been a while since I'd gone camping on my own. The last trip was years ago when I was a teenager. This time, though, I wanted something different, something quiet and away from everything. So I planned a solo camping trip deep in the woods. I wasn't looking for adventure, not really, just solitude and the chance to unwind. But that's not what I got. I found a spot by a creek, far from any trail, where the trees crowded the ground and thick bushes made it almost impossible to see beyond a few feet. It was the kind of place that gave off an unsettling vibe, the kind of place where people usually don't go. And that was perfect for me. I set up my tent and started a fire. The evening light was slowly fading, and a cool breeze made the trees sway. There were no sounds of birds or animals, just the rustle of the leaves and the constant rush of water from the creek. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. I was deep in thought, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I pushed it away. I had planned for this to be my escape, my chance to just be in nature and get away from the stress of everyday life. I cooked some food over the fire, nothing fancy, just a few cans of soup, and then I settled into my tent for the night. The night was cold, colder than I expected, and I zipped up my sleeping bag tightly. It didn't take long for the darkness to swallow up everything outside, and the only light I had came from the small lantern I'd left on a rock near the tent entrance. But sleep didn't come as easily as I thought it would. I kept hearing noises from outside, faint rustling like something was moving around in the underbrush. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but after a while, the sounds became more deliberate, like something was circling my campsite. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The rustling stopped for a moment, and then I heard a twig snap. It was so close that I could almost feel it. My heart began to race. I waited for what felt like hours, but the sound never came again. The night was quiet, and eventually, exhaustion took over. I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to a chill in the air and an odd feeling in my chest. The fire from the night before had long gone out, but there was something else, something strange. I looked around, but everything seemed normal. The creek still ran in the distance, the trees still towered over me, and the campsite still sat just as I'd left it. But as I stood up and stretched, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. There were large footprints, far too big to be mine, leading around the tent. They didn't look like animal prints either. They were human-shaped, but they weren't right. The toes were stretched out too far, and the soles seemed unnaturally wide. I froze, staring at them, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself it was just someone else camping nearby, but there was no way anyone would be out here. Not in this remote part of the forest. I grabbed my backpack and began to pack up quickly. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. Whoever, whatever, had been outside my tent last night had left these prints. And the worst part? They weren't there when I'd gone to bed. They had appeared overnight. I didn't waste any time trying to figure it out. I stuffed everything into my backpack and started walking, heading back toward the main trail. I wasn't taking any chances, but as I walked, I noticed something else. The air felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence. It was like the trees were closing in on me, and with every step I took, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the woods. After a few hours of walking, I finally reached the main trail. It was a relief to see the familiar markings and signs. But just as I thought I might be in the clear, I heard something. A voice, a whisper. It was too faint to make out, but it was there. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse quickening. It wasn't coming from the direction of the trail. It was off to my right, through the trees. I stood still for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, clearer. It sounded like someone calling my name, but there was no one around. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing at the edge of the trees, peering into the thick underbrush. And then I saw it, a figure crouched low to the ground, just on the edge of the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was hunched over, its back curved in a way that seemed unnatural. I couldn't make out much more of it in the dim light, but the shape of its head and limbs were wrong. It looked like something that shouldn't exist. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, or where I was going, but I just kept running. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, and every time I thought I was nearing the edge, the trees only got denser. It felt like the woods were swallowing me whole, keeping me trapped inside. Eventually, I reached the river again, the same creek where I had camped the night before. I stopped, breathing heavily, and looked around. Everything seemed the same. The camp was gone, erased as if it had never been there at all. My tent, my fire pit, everything I had left behind was simply gone. I sat down on the ground, trying to process what had happened. My mind was racing. Had I imagined the whole thing? Had I been dreaming? It didn't make sense. But there was one thing that I couldn't deny, the feeling. The feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching me, and then I heard it again, the whispering. But this time it wasn't in the trees. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the dense forest, dark and silent. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the sun started to rise again. The morning light crept over the horizon, and slowly, the world started to feel normal again. The whispers faded away, the air cleared, and the weight on my chest lifted. I stood up, my legs shaky, and began walking back to the main trail once more. I didn't look back. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be just me, the quiet of the woods, and a break from the chaos of everyday life. I chose a remote site, far off the usual trails. The thought of being alone in nature, disconnected from the digital world, was incredibly appealing. I was prepared, had all the gear: a sturdy tent, plenty of food, a good sleeping bag, a well-packed first aid kit. What could go wrong? The day I arrived was beautiful, the kind of crisp, clear afternoon that makes you feel like you're exactly where you should be. The trees around me were tall and strong, their branches swaying lightly in the breeze. The ground was soft and earthy, the kind of dirt that smells fresh, as though it's been untouched for ages. The campsite was nestled beside a small creek, its gentle babbling the only sound except for the occasional bird call. I set up my tent quickly, unpacked my supplies, and started a small fire. The crackling warmth felt like a luxury after the long hike. As the sun began to set, I made some hot soup and settled in to enjoy the stillness. The night was peaceful at first. The forest around me seemed to breathe in time with my own breath, the rustling of leaves barely disturbing the quiet. But then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, a sound caught my attention. It wasn't the usual noise of animals in the night, the rustling of leaves or the scamper of small feet. This was something different, something deliberate. I sat up, listening intently, but whatever it was had stopped. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. The sounds around me seemed too clear now, too sharp. My mind began to race, imagining things I couldn't quite put a name to. Every rustle, every crack of a twig, felt amplified in the stillness. The shadows in the trees seemed to grow darker, more menacing. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe an owl or a deer, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the dark. Nothing. The beam of light barely pierced the blackness. I knew that the forest could play tricks on your mind, especially at night, but this was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I stayed awake for hours, straining to hear anything that might explain the unease building inside me. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was still dark, but there was something wrong. The air felt colder, heavier. I pulled my blanket tighter around me and listened again. That same noise from earlier, the one that had made me uneasy, was back. A faint rustling, but this time closer. Too close. I grabbed the flashlight again, but before I could turn it on, a sound came from directly behind me. A snap of a twig, followed by a low, almost imperceptible shuffle. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My heart raced. There was no way I was imagining this. Someone or something was out there just beyond the trees. I wanted to call out, to let whoever it was know that I was awake, but the thought of drawing attention to myself terrified me. I had no idea who or what was out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I slowly turned my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the dark, but it revealed nothing. Just trees, just shadows. Yet the feeling that I wasn't alone only grew stronger. I lay there in silence, listening, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. A slow, deliberate crunching sound came from the edge of the woods, followed by a faint scraping noise, like someone or something dragging something heavy across the ground. My thoughts raced. Should I get out of the tent and confront whatever it was? Could it be a fellow camper? The noise didn't sound human, though. It was too steady, too unnatural. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, hoping whatever it was would go away. But the sounds didn't stop. They circled around me, growing closer, as if the source of them was walking around my camp. I didn't dare move, not even a twitch. I heard the faintest sound of something brushing against my tent, a soft, almost imperceptible scrape. My stomach churned. I was terrified to look, but I had to. Slowly, I lifted the flap of the tent just enough to peek out. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was no one there, at least not that I could see. But I saw something else. The dirt around my tent was disturbed, like someone, or something, had been pacing in circles around it. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. There was no way any person could move that quietly, not without making some noise. And yet, whatever it was had done just that. It was like a predator, stalking me, waiting for the right moment. I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't stay here another minute. I grabbed my pack and threw on my boots. I knew I couldn't go back down the trail I came in on. It would take too long, and I couldn't risk running into whatever was out there. So, I did what seemed like the only option. I headed into the woods, away from the camp. I moved as quietly as I could, but every step felt like a clumsy mistake. The forest seemed to swallow up every sound, leaving me with the oppressive silence and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was hard to tell how far I'd gone when I heard it again. Something heavy, dragging itself through the underbrush. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds were getting closer, too close. I couldn't risk being caught. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. And then, in the distance, I saw it, light. Not a flash, not a flicker, but a steady glow, like a lantern. Cabin just ahead. I didn't know how it got there, but I wasn't questioning it. I ran toward it, the light growing brighter with each step. As I neared the cabin, I heard a door creak open, and I practically dove inside. The door slammed shut behind me, and I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. The light in the cabin flickered, but it stayed on, casting long shadows on the walls. I didn't care. I was safe. For the moment, at least. I sat there, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm the panic that still gripped my chest. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been stalking me, was gone. I didn't know where it had gone or why it had stopped, but I wasn't about to question my luck. The night passed in silence, but I didn't sleep. Couldn't. By morning, the sun was up, and the light filtering through the windows felt like a blessing. I was exhausted, but I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here forever. I packed my things, leaving the cabin behind and making my way back down the trail, keeping my eyes peeled for anything that might have followed me. When I reached my car, I didn't stop to look back. I drove home as fast as I could, never once slowing down. Whatever had happened in those woods, I wasn't going to be going back. Ever. That was the last time I went camping alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a simple getaway in the woods, just me and my tent. No one around for miles. The kind of trip I'd been looking forward to for weeks. The plan was to enjoy the fresh air, take a few hikes, read my book by the campfire, and forget about everything for a couple of days. Little did I know that things wouldn't go as planned. I had picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. The kind of place most people would avoid, which is exactly why I liked it. My tent was set up beside a small stream, the sound of the water making it feel even more isolated and peaceful. The air was crisp, and the forest was full of life. Birds chirping, squirrels running through the trees, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Felt perfect. I had everything I needed. A small stove for cooking, a fire pit, a couple of cans of food, and enough water to last the weekend. I spent the first few hours hiking around, getting familiar with the area. The forest felt thick, like a wall of trees surrounding me, but in a comforting way. The ground was soft, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating a gentle glow on the forest floor. I wasn't too far from my camp, but far enough to feel like I was truly alone in nature. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to head back to my tent, but I didn't want to just sit around. Instead, I pulled out my book and settled by the stream, listening to the water rush by as I read. The peace of the forest was overwhelming, almost as if time didn't exist. I was completely absorbed in my book when I heard something. A faint sound, almost like footsteps on the dry leaves, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. I froze. I had already been in the woods for a few hours, and the only living creatures I had seen were small animals. Rabbits, birds, and squirrels. The sound was distinct. It wasn't a bird, and it wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic for that. Someone or something was walking through the woods, and it wasn't just passing by. I looked around, trying to see through the trees, but the dense foliage blocked my view. I had the immediate thought that maybe someone else was camping nearby, but I hadn't seen any other signs of campsites on my hike. No fire rings, no litter, nothing that suggested anyone had been in the area recently. I sat there listening, my heart rate picking up. The sound stopped. Dead silence. The kind of silence that makes you realize just how noisy the world usually is. My mind raced. Should I call out? Should I go back to my camp and pack up? But no, I wasn't going to let a little noise scare me off. It was probably just an animal, I convinced myself. I tried to shake it off and refocused on my book, but I couldn't concentrate. Every rustle in the trees, every breeze in the leaves, made me jump. I had no reason to be afraid, but the uneasy feeling lingered. It felt wrong, like something was off. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, followed by the occasional snap of a twig. It was coming from the direction of the stream, not far from where I was sitting. My heart was pounding now. I stood up quickly, looking around. My instincts told me to go back to the tent, but I didn't want to show fear. Whoever or whatever was out there, I wasn't about to run from it. I moved quietly toward the source of the noise, staying low and trying to stay hidden behind the trees. The footsteps were louder now. I was getting closer. The sound wasn't quite right, though. It was uneven, like whoever was walking didn't care about making noise or wasn't used to being in the woods. Finally, I saw him. A man, not too far off, standing just beyond the edge of my camp. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and pants, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He didn't see me at first. I froze again, hidden behind the trees, trying to figure out what he was doing. I had to admit I was nervous now. I had no idea who this person was or what he was doing so far from any marked trail. The man seemed lost, though, from the way he was scanning the trees. He didn't seem to be looking for me, but he was looking for something. I waited, my breath caught in my throat. It didn't seem right. This man didn't belong here. There was no way he could have just wandered in. This area wasn't on any maps. It wasn't a place people accidentally ended up. And yet here he was, standing in the middle of the woods, staring off into the distance. Something didn't sit right. He took a few more steps toward the stream, and that's when I noticed something even stranger. He seemed to be talking to himself, muttering under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but there was an urgency to his tone. My gut told me this wasn't some casual hiker. There was something wrong with the way he moved, like he wasn't supposed to be there. I should have turned back then, but something made me stay. I had to know what was going on. I waited another minute, trying to stay completely still. When he turned away from the stream and began walking back in the direction of my camp, I decided it was time to leave. Slowly, I backed away, being as quiet as possible. I didn't want to confront this guy. I didn't want to find out what he was up to. My instincts told me to get out of there, and that's exactly what I planned to do. I made my way back toward the camp, careful not to make a sound. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my heart stop. My tent was open, the flaps wide apart, and my gear was scattered across the ground. The backpack I had left beside the fire pit was missing, and in its place was a trail of footprints leading away from the tent, heading deeper into the woods. I froze. He had been in my camp. He had been watching me, and now he was gone. But where? And why had he taken my bag? It wasn't just any bag. It had my phone, my wallet, and all my supplies. Without it, I was stranded. I felt my pulse quicken. Panic was starting to creep in. I was alone, deep in the forest, with no one around for miles. The sun was beginning to set, and I had no idea where the man had gone or what he was doing. I knew I had to make a decision. Leave and try to find help, or stay and wait for him to return. I decided to stay, at least for a little while. I couldn't afford to make a rash decision, and I wanted to be sure he was really gone. I found a spot to hide behind some bushes, keeping an eye on my camp, praying that the man wasn't coming back. Hours passed in complete silence. No sounds from the forest, no movement. It was eerie. I had no choice but to wait. When the night finally fell, I knew it was my chance. I grabbed what little gear I had left, including my flashlight, and started walking back toward the road where I had parked my car. I wasn't sure if the man was still out there, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. After what felt like an eternity, I made it back to the car. I didn't stop to look behind me, just threw everything in the back seat and drove off. I didn't care if I was leaving a campsite behind. The woods, the man, and whatever else was out there, it didn't matter anymore. I was out. By the time I reached the nearest town, I finally took a deep breath. I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been terribly off, that I had narrowly escaped whatever that man was up to, and I never went back to those woods again. It started out like any other camping trip. I had packed my gear the night before, made sure to bring enough supplies, and double-checked that I had everything from food to the first aid kit. I was excited. I'd heard so much about Deadwood Hollow, a secluded spot deep in the woods that only the most experienced hikers ventured to. It was quiet, far from civilization, and had a reputation for being peaceful, just the kind of place I needed to get away from the noise and rush of everyday life. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The sky was crisp, the air cool and fresh. I had the entire weekend to myself, and I was determined to enjoy every minute of it. The trail was relatively easy to follow, a winding path that led me through towering pines and wildflower meadows. Birds chirped overhead, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves, creating a calming soundtrack for my journey. There was something soothing about being in nature, away from everything, just you and the wilderness. After a few hours of hiking, I came across the first sign of Deadwood Hollow, a moss-covered sign nailed to a tree, half hidden by overgrown vines. I pushed my way through the underbrush, careful not to lose my balance on the uneven ground. The hollow was known for being difficult to access, which made it all the more appealing to those who sought solitude. The path here was much more rugged, with thick roots snaking across the ground, forcing me to watch my every step. But I didn't mind. It felt like I was truly entering an untouched part of the forest, a place where no one had been for days, maybe weeks. As I continued deeper into the hollow, the air seemed to change. It grew cooler, the trees taller, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight. A sense of stillness hung in the air, the kind that makes you aware of every sound around you. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of an animal in the brush. For some reason, the stillness felt unnerving, but I shrugged it off. I had been hiking alone before, and I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me. This was just part of the adventure. I set up camp by a small stream that ran through the hollow. The sound of the water was comforting, and I figured it would help drown out any strange noises from the forest. I pitched my tent, unpacked my gear, and started a small fire. As I sat there, watching the flames flicker and dance, I felt the exhaustion of the hike start to settle in. I knew it was still early in the day, but the stillness of the hollow made me feel like time had slowed down. I decided to make some tea, taking my time as the kettle heated over the fire. The scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air, and I allowed myself to relax. But that's when I first heard it. A twig snapped in the distance. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't a sound I was familiar with. It was too deliberate. Not the kind of noise made by a deer or a squirrel, something bigger, something that seemed to be moving with purpose. I glanced around, but the woods were silent again. I told myself it was nothing, that it was probably just a larger animal making its way through the forest. After all, I had read that Deadwood Hollow was home to bears and wild boars. The thought should have calmed me, but it didn't. There was something about the way the sound lingered in the air that felt off. I decided to ignore it and went about making my tea. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but all I saw was the dense forest, silent and still. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ground. The temperature dropped quickly, and I pulled on an extra layer to stay warm. As the night settled in, the fire crackled, and I felt a brief sense of comfort. It was strange, though. The woods, which had seemed so calm earlier, now felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid. I had been on solo camping trips before, and I knew that these feelings came with being in unfamiliar territory. But the more I tried to push it out of my mind, the stronger it became. I crawled into my tent as darkness fully engulfed the hollow. The wind picked up, causing the trees to creak and groan. Every gust seemed to carry a faint whisper, like the forest itself was speaking to me. I lay there wide awake, staring at the fabric of the tent as it fluttered in the wind. The sounds of the forest had become more pronounced, more ominous. The cracking of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the shifting of the ground beneath me. It all seemed too deliberate, too coordinated. Then I heard it again, a soft tapping on the side of the tent. My heart raced, and I held my breath, hoping that it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal brushing against the fabric. But the tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. It sounded too precise. It wasn't a random noise. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. I slowly unzipped the tent, my hands trembling. The night air was cold against my skin, and I could see my breath in the dim light of the fire. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there. The campfire crackled in the distance, and the trees loomed in the darkness, silent and unmoving. I waited for a moment, straining my ears, but I couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary. I zipped the tent back up, my heart still racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The night dragged on. I lay there, unable to sleep, my mind racing with every possible scenario. I kept hearing the tapping, faint but persistent, coming from different parts of the tent. Sometimes it would be soft, like a knock on the door, and other times it would be louder, like something was testing the strength of the fabric. I didn't dare open the tent again. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. The hollow was still quiet, but the air felt different now. It was thick, oppressive, like something had changed during the night. I quickly packed up my camp, eager to leave. I didn't know what had happened the night before, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. As I hiked out of the hollow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The trail back seemed longer, the trees taller, the silence heavier. But when I finally reached the trailhead, the sense of unease began to lift. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, faster now, until I finally reached my car. I never went back to Deadwood Hollow. I'm not sure what happened that night, but something about the place didn't sit right with me. I still don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me or if there was something in those woods that didn't want me there. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget the sound of the tapping. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, even when I was alone in the dark. Maybe some places are meant to be left alone, and Deadwood Hollow is one of them. I don't care how peaceful it's supposed to be. That place is off limits as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. I heard from some other hikers that they had similar experiences. Maybe it's just the isolation that does something to you, or maybe there's something else. Something hidden in the woods, something that only reveals itself when the night falls. Whatever it is, I'll never be returning to find out. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just me, the woods, and the silence that always feels so calming. I've always been a fan of camping alone, away from the noise of the world.
No distractions.
Just the crackling of a fire, the smell of fresh pine trees, and the calm rustling of leaves. I had been on countless camping trips before, but this one would end up being far from the peaceful experience I had imagined. The weather forecast was clear, a cool night with no rain, the stars expected to shine bright. Perfect. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, food, a few beers, and my trusty knife just in case. As I drove out, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. It had been a stressful few months, and the idea of being in the woods, completely disconnected from the world, felt like a dream. I was headed to a secluded spot deep in the forest, miles away from civilization. No one ever came here, and I preferred it that way. I found my spot just before sunset. It was a quiet clearing by a small creek. The gentle sound of the water rushing over rocks created the perfect backdrop for the night ahead. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get the campfire going. The air had a crisp chill to it, but nothing too cold. I gathered some wood from the surrounding area, stacking it neatly by the fire pit, and lit the fire. The warmth quickly spread, and I leaned back, watching the flames dance. Nightfall arrived, and the forest was alive with sounds. The occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the brush, the distant snap of a twig. It was a soothing noise to anyone who was used to the woods. But then there was another sound, a subtle crackling, like something large moving through the underbrush. I froze, my senses heightened. I'd spent enough time camping to recognize animal sounds, but this didn't quite match anything I knew. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the noise. The beam of light swept over the trees, the undergrowth, the rocks by the creek. Nothing, just the usual wilderness. I relaxed, telling myself it was just the wind or a deer, but something felt off. My gut told me I wasn't alone. I shook it off, focusing on the fire and pushing the feeling to the back of my mind. I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin my night. After a while, the noises seemed to fade away, and I convinced myself it was just my nerves. I cracked open a beer and took a long sip, letting the cold liquid settle in my stomach. I looked up at the stars, enjoying the beauty of the moment. There was something so humbling about being alone in nature, a feeling of insignificance in the vastness of the wilderness. But as I stared up at the sky, I saw something strange, a faint light, barely visible through the trees. I assumed it was just a plane or some other natural light, but then it flickered and disappeared. I stood up, my heart rate quickening. There was no reason for lights out here, not for miles around. The nearest road was at least a couple of hours away by foot. I shook my head, thinking it must have been some trick of the light, maybe the glow of a distant star through the branches. But still, that feeling in my gut returned. I decided to go check it out just to be sure. I grabbed my flashlight, leaving the warmth of the fire behind, and walked toward the trees where I'd seen the light. The woods around me were eerily quiet. The usual night sounds seemed to fade as I moved deeper into the trees. My breath was coming faster now, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes, when I came to a small clearing. The trees parted slightly, and there, just ahead, was a strange sight. A small, dim light flickered on the ground. It wasn't from a flashlight or anything I could recognize. It was more like the glow of fireflies, but too bright, too focused. I walked toward it cautiously. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a light. There were shapes around it, figures like shadows moving in the darkness. I stood there, frozen, not sure whether to move forward or turn back. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. My first instinct was to turn and run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity, fear, I don't know. The light flickered again, and I saw something else. A piece of fabric, torn and frayed, hanging from a tree branch. It was red, blood red. My heart skipped a beat. I had to get out of there. The eerie feeling had become overwhelming, and my body was screaming at me to leave. I turned around to make my way back to the fire, but as I did, I heard it again, the sound. The cracking of twigs, followed by soft footfalls. Not from animals. This was too deliberate. Someone or something was following me. I broke into a run, not caring about the noise I made as I crashed through the underbrush, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there, what I had just seen. The figures, the light, the fabric. I had to get back to my tent. When I finally reached the clearing by the creek, I stopped for a moment, my breath ragged. I scanned the trees, expecting to see something moving, but there was nothing. The fire was still burning, the crackling sound almost comforting now. I took a few deep breaths, trying to steady my nerves. That's when I noticed it. Something was off. My tent was no longer in the same place. It had been shifted, pulled away from the fire pit. And there, near the edge of the clearing, were more of those strange red fabric pieces. They were scattered around the base of a tree, like someone had been there recently, watching me. I felt my stomach drop. There was no logical explanation for what I was seeing. But there was one thing I knew for sure, whatever it wasn't a coincidence. I wasn't going to stay out there any longer. I grabbed my gear as quickly as I could, not bothering to pack everything. I just needed to leave. The woods had turned from a peaceful retreat into a nightmare. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle in the trees, felt like a threat. I didn't care what it was that had followed me. People, animals, or something else. I needed to get back to civilization. I ran back to my car, the light of the fire flickering behind me as I disappeared into the trees. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life beneath me. I didn't even look back as I drove away, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time I reached the nearest town, it was late, but I didn't care. I found a small motel and checked in, my mind racing with what had just happened. The next morning, I went to the local sheriff's office. They didn't seem too concerned when I told them about the strange light, the fabric, and the feeling of being watched. They chalked it up to a bear or some other wild animal, maybe even a prank. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. The sheriff didn't know this part of the woods like I did. He didn't understand. It's been weeks since that night, and I haven't gone back to that spot. I don't think I ever will. Sometimes when I'm walking through the woods, I hear a rustle in the trees, and for just a moment, I feel that same unease, like something or someone is still watching. But I've moved on. I found other places to camp, other spots that feel safe. But I'll never forget that night. I'll never forget the way the light flickered and the feeling of being hunted, the red fabric, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the dark. That was the night I learned that not all parts of the forest are meant to be explored. It was a late autumn weekend when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. The weather had cooled down, and the trees were almost bare, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the fading light. I had been thinking about this trip for weeks. A few days of quiet solitude in the woods sounded perfect for clearing my mind. I chose a secluded spot near a lake I had been to before, a place not many people visited. The trail leading there was rugged and barely marked, but that was exactly what drew me in. I packed my backpack with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, a small cooking stove, and of course my trusty flashlight. The drive out to the campsite was about 2 hours, and as I drove deeper into the forest, the air grew thicker and the sunlight seemed to fade faster. The last stretch of the road was bumpy, and the car rattled as it bumped over the uneven path. Finally, I parked near the trailhead, and the silence of the forest hit me immediately. There were no birds, no insects, just an unsettling stillness. After gathering my gear, I began the hike. The path twisted and turned, sometimes barely wide enough for my boots to fit. I could hear the crunch of dead leaves underfoot, the only sound breaking the quiet. The deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something, though I couldn't quite place what it was. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was an odd, inexplicable feeling, as if I was walking into a place I didn't belong. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was just about to dip below the horizon. I set up my camp by the water's edge, careful to avoid the wet ground. The air had grown colder, and a fine mist was rising off the water, making everything look more mysterious. I started a small fire to keep warm, the flames crackling as they fought against the dampness of the woods. As I sat there, staring into the fire, I felt the weight of the solitude. It was peaceful, but there was something in the air, something that didn't quite sit right. Night came quickly, and I ate my dinner, the only sound being the occasional pop of the fire. The lake was eerily quiet, its surface like glass, reflecting the nearly full moon. I sat for a while, letting my mind wander, but that nagging feeling returned. It was subtle, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something was out there, watching. The logical side of me brushed it off as nothing, but I couldn't help it. The air felt thick, too thick for comfort. The shadows around me stretched unnaturally long, and the firelight flickered with each gust of wind, casting weird, twisting shapes around my campsite. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, trying to ignore the growing unease that gnawed at me. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves outside, but inside the tent, it was warm and quiet. I zipped myself up tightly in my sleeping bag, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept listening to the sounds of the forest, which now seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The occasional creak of a tree in the wind, the distant rustle of something in the brush. And then there was something else, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. The sound was unmistakable. A person or something large moving through the forest. The crunching grew louder, closer. I couldn't move, couldn't even think straight. It was as if my body was in some kind of suspended animation, paralyzed by fear. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers trembling as I clicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. But I saw nothing. No movement, no shapes, just the same trees swaying in the wind. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, waiting for whatever it was to make itself known. But it never did. The footsteps stopped, and the forest fell back into its eerie silence. I didn't know if I had imagined it, or if something was out there, but I wasn't willing to take any chances. I decided to pack up and leave, but as I unzipped the tent, I stopped dead in my tracks. A figure had emerged from the trees, standing on the far side of the campfire. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the silhouette, too far for me to make out any details. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what I was seeing, but the figure didn't move. I didn't know if it was a person or something else entirely. My first instinct was to yell, to demand to know who they were, but I swallowed the words. Something about the figure's stillness made me hesitate. It wasn't right. I reached for my knife, tucked safely in my backpack, and then nothing. The figure turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the trees as silently as it had appeared. I blinked, my mind trying to process what had just happened. It was as though it was just an illusion, or maybe someone had wandered off the trail and didn't realize I was there. But the fear lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a long while, I finally fell into a restless sleep, the unease still gripping my chest. The next morning, I packed up quickly, ready to get out of there. The forest seemed just as quiet, but the air felt different. Lighter, almost like something had changed overnight. I retraced my steps, eager to leave the area behind. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the woods, but nothing ever appeared. I made it back to the trailhead without incident, but the feeling that had followed me from the moment I set up camp never fully left. It was a long drive back, and I spent the entire journey trying to make sense of what had happened. The footsteps, the figure by the fire, and the overwhelming sense that I had crossed into a place that wasn't meant for me. I told myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that I had been too tired or too paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was out there, something I would never understand. In the end, I never went back to that spot by the lake. I don't know what I saw that night or what was lurking in the woods, but I learned to respect the solitude of the forest in a new way. Sometimes nature isn't as peaceful as it seems. Sometimes there are things in the dark that we're better off never understanding. And with that, I walked away from that camping trip with more than just memories. I carried with me a sense of caution, a quiet understanding that some places, some moments, are meant to stay unexplained. But whatever was out there, it stayed in the woods, and I was just happy to leave it behind. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me and the woods. I'd been hiking for years, and I was used to the quiet isolation of the forest, the sound of my boots crunching on the leaves, the birds above me, the occasional squirrel darting across the trail. I'd always enjoyed that peaceful feeling, the kind you can only get when you're far away from the noise of everyday life. But that trip, something felt different. And by the end of it, I wasn't sure I'd ever trust the woods again. The plan was simple. I wanted to go out alone. No distractions, no company, just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I chose a quiet spot deep in the woods, somewhere away from the usual trails and campgrounds. I'd heard about this place from a friend who'd done some hiking around the area. The spot was supposed to be perfect, a secluded little valley with a stream running through it, surrounded by thick trees. No one else would be there. I liked that. I arrived at the trailhead around midday, my pack heavy with the gear I'd packed for a couple of nights. The sky was clear, and the sun was still high, which gave me plenty of time to get to the camp. The first few miles of the trail were well worn, clearly used by others who'd come before me. As I walked, I kept my eyes open for any signs of wildlife. I'd seen deer, foxes, and even a bear or two in the past, but nothing this time. It was unusually quiet. After a few hours, I reached the area I was looking for. The trail had become less distinct, more overgrown. The trees were denser here, and the air smelled richer, as if I had stepped deeper into the heart of the forest. I set up camp near the stream, the sound of the water comforting. It was a beautiful place, peaceful, serene, just what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I ate my dinner, sat by the fire, and enjoyed the solitude. The stars were bright, the fire crackling softly in the quiet of the night. I felt relaxed, at peace, like I was part of something bigger. The only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. I settled into my tent and slept soundly. The next day, I woke early, as the sun began to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I decided to spend the day exploring to get a better feel for the area. I packed a small day bag with water, a few snacks, and my map, and set off, following the stream deeper into the woods. The farther I went, the more the landscape changed. The trees grew thicker, and the underbrush became more tangled. It felt as though the forest was closing in around me, but I shrugged it off. After all, it was just the nature of the wilderness. Hours passed, and I had wandered far from camp. I wasn't lost. At least I didn't think I was. But I realized that the trail had completely disappeared. There were no signs of the path I'd been following earlier, no markers or anything to guide me back. I wasn't worried at first. I'd been lost before, but I knew how to navigate. I just needed to retrace my steps. But the problem was, nothing looked familiar. The trees were taller now, and the forest seemed unnaturally dense. The more I looked around, the more I felt something was off. I kept walking, hoping to find something, anything, that would help me find my way back. But after another hour of wandering, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't an immediate threat, but something had changed. The air felt heavy, as if the forest itself was watching me. I couldn't explain it, but every so often, I'd hear something. A twig snapping in the distance, the sound of something moving just out of sight. I stopped, straining to listen, but the woods fell silent again, too silent. I checked my phone, but there was no service, no surprise there. I wasn't relying on technology for this trip, but it would have been nice to have a little reassurance. I pulled out my map and tried to get my bearings, but the forest all looked the same. I was starting to get frustrated, but more than that, I was starting to feel uneasy. I needed to get back to camp. That's when I heard it. A noise, a low, grating sound, came from deeper in the woods, not far away. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion, though I'd never heard anything quite like it. It was too rhythmic, like something dragging itself along the forest floor. I froze, holding my breath, trying to figure out what it could be. But after a moment, the noise stopped. There was nothing. I stood there for a while, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked my watch. It was getting late. I needed to head back to camp before it got dark. But I couldn't help myself. I turned toward the sound of the noise. It was faint now, but I could still hear it, like something was moving, dragging itself along in the distance. I tried to push it out of my mind, but I couldn't. The idea that something or someone was out there watching me lingered. I kept moving, hoping to find my way back, but the noise was always there, just out of reach. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, but every step I took, it felt like the noise was getting closer, like whatever it was following me. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled across something, a small clearing in the woods. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw it. A broken, rotting tree stump with old bones scattered around it. Not animal bones, these were too large. They looked like human remains. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the bones, unable to move. There was no doubt in my mind that they were human. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. I'd heard rumors of things like this, but they were just that, rumors. Stories people told around campfires. But this felt real. I turned and ran. I didn't stop to think, didn't stop to look back. I just ran, pushing through the thick underbrush, tripping over roots, desperately trying to get back to camp. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I ran through the trees, every step feeling heavier than the last. The noise was still there, behind me, like something was dragging itself through the forest, gaining on me. I could hear it getting closer, the dragging sound louder now, unmistakable. I don't know how long I ran for. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. I finally burst into a small clearing, and there it was, my camp, the familiar sight of my tent and the fire pit, just as I'd left it. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my gear, packed everything as fast as I could, and started heading out of the clearing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't until I was halfway back to the trail that I realized I'd never heard the noise again. I looked around, but the forest was as still as it had been when I first arrived. I kept walking, trying to keep calm, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The bones, the dragging sound, the feeling of being watched. It was too much. I needed to get out of there. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was setting, the sky turning a deep orange. I didn't stop to rest. I just kept walking, not looking back. I finally made it back to my car, and I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear in the trunk, slammed the door, and drove off, not stopping until I was miles away from that cursed forest. I never went back, and I never will. I don't know what happened out there. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw, and I know that I'll never forget the sound of that dragging, the feeling that something was out there with me in the woods, just beyond the trees. But most of all, I know I'll never forget the bones. I never want to know what happened to the person they belonged to. I had always loved the idea of camping alone. Something about being in nature with no distractions felt freeing. So, when I finally got a long weekend off from work, I decided to pack up my gear and head to a remote area in the Rockies. It wasn't my first solo trip, but this one felt different from the start. I'd picked a spot far from any established campgrounds, a place I found after scouring maps for weeks. It promised isolation, a serene lake, and trails that weren't marked on any guidebooks. I arrived at the trailhead mid-morning on Friday. My car was the only one in the small dirt parking lot. That's how I wanted it. I hoisted my heavy pack onto my back, double-checked that I had everything I needed, and started hiking. The trail quickly became overgrown, with roots and rocks making every step deliberate. It was challenging, but the air was crisp, the sky clear, and the promise of solitude pushed me forward. About 3 hours in, I reached the lake. It was as beautiful as I'd hoped, maybe more. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the towering pines and jagged peaks around it. I found a flat spot about 30 yards from the shore to set up my tent. After securing my campsite, I gathered some wood for a fire later, filtered water from the lake, and settled in. The silence was profound. No cars, no people, just the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. By the time the sun began to dip behind the mountains, I had a small fire crackling. I cooked a simple meal, ate, and sat staring at the flames as darkness swallowed the landscape. It was then that I first felt it, a faint sense of unease. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I'd read about how solitude can make people hyper-aware of their surroundings. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I crawled into my tent around 9 p.m., zipping it up tight, The temperature had dropped significantly, and I was grateful for my warm sleeping bag. As I lay there, the quiet seemed oppressive. Every tiny sound outside, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, felt amplified. My heart would jump. Then I'd remind myself it was just the wind or some small animal. Eventually, I fell asleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up abruptly. It wasn't a gradual return to consciousness. It was like being jolted awake. I lay there, my heart racing, unsure of what had stirred me. The tent was pitch black. I reached for my headlamp, fumbling to turn it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent. Everything was as I'd left it. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunching sound. It wasn't the random noise of wind or animals. It was footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving just outside my campsite. My stomach dropped. I turned off the headlamp, plunging myself back into darkness. My mind raced with possibilities. A bear? A deer? No, this sounded too controlled, too human. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. I debated with myself about what to do. Should I call out? Make noise to scare off whatever it was? Or stay quiet and hope it went away? Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. But I kept my knife close, just in case. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent cautiously. The sun was up, and everything looked normal. No signs of anything unusual around the campsite. I almost laughed at how paranoid I'd been. Still, the experience lingered in my mind. I decided to stay another night, but resolved to be extra vigilant. The day passed uneventfully. I hiked around the lake, took photos, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. By the time evening rolled around, I felt more relaxed. I cooked dinner and watched the sunset, the vibrant colors reflecting off the lake's surface. As darkness fell, I built another fire and sat by it, sipping hot tea. The unease from the previous night seemed like a distant memory. But as the fire died down and I prepared to turn in, that feeling crept back. The sense that I wasn't alone. I scanned the tree line with my headlamp, the beam revealing only shadows. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I'd seen no one since arriving, and the chances of someone stumbling upon my remote campsite were slim to none. Still, I decided to take precautions. I set up a makeshift alarm system by tying some fishing line around the perimeter of my campsite, attaching it to a few empty cans I'd brought. If anything or anyone approached, the noise would alert me. Satisfied, I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep. It was well past midnight when I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that stirred me. It was the sound of the cans clattering. My heart felt like it stopped for a moment before racing uncontrollably. I grabbed my knife and headlamp, staying as quiet as possible. The noise had come from the side of the campsite nearest the lake. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. My headlamp's beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and the faint glimmer of the lake. The cans were scattered, the fishing line slack. My throat felt dry as I stepped out, every sense on high alert. Then I saw it. About 20 yards away, near the edge of the water, there was a figure. It was faintly illuminated by the moonlight, standing perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing my direction. I couldn't make out any details, but the outline was unmistakable. I didn't call out. Something about the situation felt wrong, deeply wrong. Instead, I backed slowly toward my tent, keeping the light trained on the figure. They didn't move. Once inside, I zipped up the tent and grabbed my bear spray, clutching it tightly. My mind raced. Who were they? What did they want? Why weren't they saying anything? I sat there for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense. Eventually, I mustered the courage to peek outside again. The figure was gone. The relief was short-lived. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting upright with my knife and bear spray in hand, listening for any sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear as quickly as possible. I didn't even eat breakfast. The campsite felt oppressive, the once beautiful lake now carrying a sinister weight. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle, every shadow made me jump. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back and got inside, locking the doors immediately. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that I started to feel safe again. To this day, I have no idea who or what that figure was. Part of me wonders if it was just another camper who stumbled upon my sight. But deep down, I don't believe that. There was something off about the way they stood, the way they didn't react to my light. I haven't gone camping alone since. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from the chaos of city life. I had planned everything meticulously. A secluded campsite by the lake, plenty of food and water, a reliable tent, and enough gear to make me comfortable for 3 days. The thought of waking up to the sounds of nature, away from the constant buzz of my phone, felt like a necessary reset. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun began dipping behind the trees. The drive had been long, winding through miles of dense forest with barely another car in sight. My chosen campsite was miles away from the main campground, tucked away on a narrow dirt road that I'd found on a map. It was perfect, private, and peaceful. I set up my tent a few feet from the lake's edge, the water's surface reflecting the fiery hues of the sunset. By the time everything was in place, the sun had vanished completely, leaving only a faint orange glow on the horizon. I started a small fire, roasted a couple of hot dogs, and settled into my camping chair with a book. The night air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. Frogs croaked in the distance, and the occasional splash from the lake suggested fish jumping. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke early to the sound of birds chirping and the sun streaming through the thin fabric of my tent. After a simple breakfast, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest was dense, but there were faint trails that seemed to wind deeper into the woods. I followed one for a while, taking in the towering trees and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. About an hour into my hike, I came across something odd. A small clearing held the remnants of what looked like an old campsite. There was a rusted fire pit, a few empty cans scattered around, and a collapsed tent frame. It didn't seem recent. The tent fabric was torn and discolored, and moss had started to grow over some of the debris. Still, it was unsettling. Why would someone leave a campsite in such disarray? I shook off the uneasy feeling and continued walking. The rest of the day was uneventful. I fished in the lake, read more of my book, and cooked a simple dinner over the fire. As the sun set, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt a little more on edge than the previous night, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the abandoned campsite, or maybe it was just the isolation. Either way, I made sure to secure all my food in a bear canister and kept my flashlight and knife within arm's reach as I crawled into my tent. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. My heart pounded as I strained to hear anything beyond the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, like leaves being disturbed. It was distant at first, but seemed to grow louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, staying perfectly still as I listened. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving the silence even more oppressive. I convinced myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. Still, I barely slept the rest of the night, jumping at every imagined noise. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Just outside my tent, near the extinguished fire pit, were footprints. They weren't from an animal, they were clearly human, barefoot, judging by the shape and size. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another camper had wandered by, but why would they be barefoot and why so close to my tent? I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I stuck close to the campsite, not venturing far into the woods. The lake, usually so calming, felt ominous under the overcast sky. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. That night, I decided to stay awake for as long as I could. I kept the fire burning brighter than usual and sat in my chair, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The forest seemed to have returned to its normal rhythm, the sounds of nocturnal creatures filling the air once more. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I retreated to my tent. I woke again in the dead of night, this time to a distinct snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. My heart raced as I fumbled for my flashlight and knife. The snapping was followed by another sound, a low, steady crunching, as if someone was walking slowly through the underbrush. The noises were deliberate, not the random rustling of an animal. I held my breath, gripping the knife tightly. The sound stopped, but I could feel someone, or something, was nearby. Then, a new sound emerged, the faint, unmistakable sound of breathing. It was slow and measured, just outside the thin fabric of my tent. My mind raced with panic. Should I call out? Stay silent? Run? I stayed perfectly still, willing myself not to make a sound. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, then stopped abruptly. Minutes passed, and the forest was silent again. I waited, too afraid to move, until the first light of dawn seeped through the tent. When I finally stepped outside, the footprints were back, more numerous this time. They circled my tent and led off into the woods. I packed up my gear in record time, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into my backpack. The secluded campsite that had once felt like a haven now felt like a trap. The hike back to my car was the longest 2 hours of my life. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the car, I tossed my gear in the back and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, days later, the memory lingers. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'm certain of one thing. I won't be camping alone again. The decision to camp out in a remote area of the Appalachian Mountains was one I had mulled over for weeks. I needed the break. My job was exhausting, my relationships felt strained, and my mind was a swirling storm of deadlines and responsibilities. Camping, I thought, would be the perfect way to reset. Alone in the wilderness, with nothing but the rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets, I'd find peace. I chose a spot far off the beaten path, a little clearing I'd read about in a forum for serious backpackers. It wasn't on any official maps, but those who'd been there swore it was serene and worth the trek. The trailhead itself was obscure, requiring a 2-hour drive on winding dirt roads. I arrived early in the morning, the air crisp and the sky a pale blue. My pack was heavy, loaded with everything I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, food, a portable stove, water, and a first aid kit. I had my knife, a small axe, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I also carried a satellite phone just in case. It was a precaution I didn't expect to use, but being alone in the wilderness isn't something you take lightly. The trail was beautiful but grueling. It twisted through dense forests, up rocky inclines, and along narrow ledges that overlooked steep drops. The farther I hiked, the less sign there was of other people. No footprints in the dirt, no remnants of campfires. It was exactly what I'd wanted: complete isolation. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was everything the Forum had promised. The space was surrounded by towering pines and had a small stream running through it. The ground was soft with moss, and there was even a natural fire pit formed by a circle of stones. I set up my tent near the stream, unpacked my gear, and began gathering wood for a fire. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the sound of the trickling water was soothing. After eating a quick meal of dehydrated noodles, I spent some time exploring the area. The clearing was nestled in a small valley, and a narrow path led to a ridge overlooking the forest. The view was breathtaking, an endless sea of green stretching to the horizon. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. That night, I lit a fire and sat by it, listening to the sounds of the forest. Owls hooted in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals moving about. The stars were brilliant, unpolluted by city lights. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., feeling relaxed and ready for a good night's sleep. Sleep, however, didn't come easily. I'd underestimated how quiet the forest would be. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves outside my tent felt magnified. I reminded myself that it was just the wind or a curious raccoon, nothing to worry about. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night. My heart was pounding, though I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. I stayed still, listening. The forest was eerily silent.
No crickets, no owls.
Just the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing, that sometimes the forest goes quiet, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next morning, I tried to brush off the strange feeling. I made coffee on my portable stove and ate a quick breakfast. As I packed up my gear for a day hike, I noticed something odd. The ground around my tent looked disturbed, as if someone, or something, had walked through during the night. The prints weren't clear, just vague impressions in the moss and dirt. They could have been from an animal, but they were spaced in a way that seemed too deliberate. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was likely a deer or a bear, nothing unusual in these woods. Still, I decided to keep my knife on me during the hike, just in case. The trail I followed was narrow and overgrown, leading deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It felt claustrophobic, but I pushed on, wanting to see where the trail led. About an hour in, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach tighten. A campsite, abandoned and overgrown. The tent was collapsed, its fabric torn and faded. Nearby, a rusted cooking pot lay half-buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for years. Something about it unsettled me. Why would someone leave their gear behind like this? Had they gotten lost, injured, or had they left in a hurry? I didn't linger. The sight of the abandoned campsite had dampened my enthusiasm for exploring. I headed back to my own site, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt different now, less inviting. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. Back at my camp, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent the afternoon fishing in the stream, catching a few small trout. Cooking them over the fire gave me a sense of normalcy, a reminder that I was here to relax and disconnect. But as the sun set, the unease returned. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the abandoned campsite, the silence of the forest at night. That night, I made sure the fire was big and bright before crawling into my tent. I kept my knife within reach and left the flashlight on next to me. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by every sound outside. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, a distinct snapping of twigs, followed by the rustle of leaves. It was close, maybe 20 feet from my tent. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound moved, circling the camp. Whatever it was deliberate. Not the random movements of an animal, but something or someone moving with purpose. I gripped my knife tightly, debating whether to call out or stay silent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The sound stopped. Minutes passed, then an hour. I stayed awake, clutching the knife, until the first light of dawn crept into the tent. When I finally stepped outside, the camp looked undisturbed, but the sense of being watched lingered. I decided then and there to cut the trip short. I'd come here for peace, but all I'd found was paranoia. Packing up took less than an hour. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd hear something, a branch snapping, leaves rustling. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing. The sense of being followed grew stronger with every step. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, not just from the hike, but from the sheer anxiety. I threw my pack in the trunk, started the engine, and didn't look back. As I drove away, the forest seemed to close in behind me, its secrets safe once more. I never found out what or who had been out there. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe it was my own mind playing tricks on me. But one thing was certain: I wouldn't be camping alone again anytime soon. It started as a regular camping trip, something I'd done dozens of times before. I had planned to spend a weekend in the remote woods of Vermont, near a small lake I discovered years ago. It wasn't on any map, and that's why I liked it. The isolation and quiet always helped me clear my mind. The drive took a little over 3 hours, with the last stretch on a dirt road that was barely wide enough for my truck. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. The air was crisp, cooler than I expected for early fall, but I welcomed it. I parked at the edge of the woods, loaded my gear onto my back, and started the hike to my usual campsite. It was a mile or so from the parking spot, deep enough to avoid any signs of civilization, but close enough to retreat if something went wrong. The trail was narrow and uneven, covered with fallen leaves and roots. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the ground and the occasional rustle of wildlife. When I reached the campsite, I was relieved to find it just as I'd left it on my last visit. A flat clearing with a fire ring made of stones, a sturdy tree for hanging food, and a view of the lake that always took my breath away. The water was calm, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the sunset. I set up my tent quickly, eager to settle in before darkness fell. My tent was small but reliable, something I trusted on countless trips. After pitching the tent, I gathered firewood from the surrounding area. The process was methodical, almost meditative. Snap, break, pile. Once I had enough, I built a small fire and lit it, watching as the flames licked the dry wood and grew. I cooked a simple meal, a can of chili heated over the fire, and ate while listening to the sounds of the forest. Frogs croaked near the lake, crickets chirped in the bushes, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd come here for. By the time I finished eating, the sun had fully set, and the stars blanketed the sky. I spent some time staring up at them, letting my thoughts drift. The fire crackled softly, its warmth keeping the chill at bay. I eventually crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and let the forest lull me to sleep. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up with the sun, feeling rested and ready for a day of exploring. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my small day pack and headed toward the other side of the lake. The terrain was rugged, with dense underbrush and uneven ground, but I enjoyed the challenge. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I felt alive, fully immersed in the wilderness. I spent hours wandering, taking note of animal tracks, interesting plants, and the occasional bird flitting through the trees. Around midday, I found a small clearing with a rock outcrop that provided a stunning view of the surrounding area. I sat there for a while, eating my lunch and soaking in the solitude. On my way back to camp, I noticed something odd. A tree near the trail had deep scratches running down its trunk, parallel lines that looked deliberate. They were too high up to be caused by a small animal, and they didn't match the claw marks of a bear. I'd seen bear scratches before, and these were different, closer together, almost like they were made by a large set of prongs. I stared at them for a while, uneasy but unable to explain them. Eventually, I shrugged it off and continued on. When I returned to camp, everything was as I'd left it. The fire pit was untouched, my gear was still in place, and there were no signs of anyone or anything having been there. I told myself the scratches were probably old, maybe made by some animal I wasn't familiar with. The woods were full of mysteries, after all. That evening, I repeated my routine, gathering wood, making a fire, cooking dinner. As darkness fell, the forest seemed quieter than the night before. The usual symphony of frogs and crickets was subdued, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the warmth of the fire and the beauty of the stars above. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a sound outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, but it was enough to jolt me upright. I held my breath, listening intently. The rustling came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of leaves. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light illuminated the trees, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The forest was still, the only movement coming from the flickering shadows cast by my dying fire. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer, something harmless, and crawled back into my sleeping bag. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, every little sound amplifying in my mind, until exhaustion finally took over. The next morning, I found tracks near my campsite. They were large and oval-shaped, unlike any animal tracks I'd seen before. They led from the edge of the clearing to the fire pit and then disappeared into the woods. I crouched down to examine them, trying to make sense of what could have made them. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear, a large dog, maybe even a person, but none of them felt right. I spent the day feeling on edge, my usual enjoyment of the wilderness replaced by a lingering unease. I decided to stick close to camp, not wanting to venture too far in case something was out there. I kept my hatchet close, finding comfort in its solid weight. By the time night fell, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were louder and more deliberate. Branches snapped, and something heavy moved through the underbrush. I stayed in my tent, gripping my hatchet and flashlight, too afraid to look. The sounds circled my campsite, coming closer and then retreating, as if whatever it was testing me. It went on for hours, or at least it felt that way. When dawn finally broke, the noises stopped. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, every muscle in my body tense. The campsite looked undisturbed, but the tracks were back, more numerous this time. They surrounded my tent, leading in chaotic patterns that made no sense. My heart pounded as I realized whatever had been out there was no ordinary animal. I decided to cut my trip short. Packing up took longer than usual because I kept stopping to look around, my nerves on edge. As I hiked back to the truck, I felt like I was being watched. The forest was silent, too silent, and every shadow seemed to move. I forced myself to keep going, one step at a time, until I finally reached the safety of my vehicle. When I got home, I couldn't shake the experience. I researched wildlife in the area, trying to identify the tracks and the scratches, but nothing matched. I even considered reporting it to a local ranger, but what would I say? That something unknown had stalked me in the woods? It sounded ridiculous. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on that trip. I haven't been back to that lake, and I'm not sure I ever will. The woods, once a place of peace for me, now carry a weight of fear. Whatever was out there, it reminded me of something I'd always known but never fully understood. Nature doesn't owe us safety, and sometimes it holds secrets we're not meant to uncover. I've always loved camping. There's something about the quiet of the woods, the smell of the trees, and the simplicity of being away from everything that makes me feel alive. But this trip wasn't like any of the others. It started with a simple plan. 3 days alone in the mountains to clear my head and reset after a stressful year. What I didn't know was that this trip would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about safety, solitude, and survival. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from my house. I left early, just as the sun began to rise, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. My pack was heavy, but I'd packed carefully. Food for 3 days, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, and enough water to last until I reached the stream marked on my map. I'd chosen a less popular trail to avoid crowds. I wanted to be alone, to feel like the only person in the world for a while. The first few hours were peaceful. The trail wound through dense forest, the ground cushioned by a thick layer of pine needles. Birds chirped overhead, and every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of a deer darting through the trees. I was in my element, taking my time and soaking it all in. The air smelled fresh, the kind of clean that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. By midday, I'd covered about 6 miles and reached the stream I'd seen on the map. It was a perfect spot to set up camp. The water was clear and cold, tumbling over smooth rocks. I pitched my tent a little way back from the water, on a flat patch of ground surrounded by tall pines. After eating a quick lunch, I spent the afternoon exploring the area. There was no one else around, just me and the forest. It was exactly what I'd been hoping for. That first night, I fell asleep to the sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that only comes when you're completely at peace. But by the second night, things started to feel off. I'd spent the day hiking further up the trail, leaving my tent and most of my gear behind. I wanted to travel light and see what was further up the mountain. The trail grew steeper and more rugged, the forest denser. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below. I sat there for a while, eating a granola bar and enjoying the solitude. But as I started back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. It's easy to get spooked when you're alone in the woods. Every snap of a twig, every shadow cast by the trees can feel like something more. But this was different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. The forest, which had felt so welcoming the day before, now seemed watchful. I picked up my pace, eager to get back to the safety of my tent. When I reached camp, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. I tried to shake off the unease as I boiled water for dinner, but as I sat there eating, the feeling only grew stronger. The forest was too quiet. The usual chorus of birds and insects was gone, replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my tent, straining to hear anything beyond the sound of my own breathing. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to an animal. But when I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight around, there was nothing, just the trees and the dark. By morning, I was exhausted. I decided to cut the trip short and head back to the trailhead. The thought of spending another night in the woods made my skin crawl. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started down the trail. The uneasy feeling followed me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A fresh set of footprints in the dirt, heading in the same direction I was. They weren't mine, the tread was different, and they were too large. Someone else had been on the trail recently. I stopped and listened, my heart pounding in my chest, but the forest was still silent. I picked up my pace, my mind racing. Who else was out here? The trail wasn't popular, and I hadn't seen anyone since I started. The footprints didn't make sense. I told myself it could be a hiker who'd taken a different route and ended up on the same trail. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The next few hours were a blur of adrenaline and paranoia. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was drenched in sweat and on the verge of panic. My car was the only one in the parking lot. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, even as I threw my pack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat. I locked the doors and started the engine, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and those woods. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But when I looked again, there was nothing there, just the forest, silent and still. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened. I've gone over it in my mind 100 times, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there really was someone out there, following me. I'll never know for sure, but one thing's certain: I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. It all started as a solo camping trip. I had always wanted to escape the noise of the city, to experience the stillness of nature with nothing but a tent, a backpack, and my thoughts. The mountains had always called to me, and that summer I decided it was time to answer. I'd picked a remote spot, far from the usual trails, hoping for peace and solitude. I parked my car at a small, unmarked trailhead early in the morning. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your breath visible in short puffs. The trail I'd chosen was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path. I checked my GPS and map to make sure I was heading in the right direction. The plan was simple: hike about 6 miles into the woods, find a good spot to set up camp, and spend the night surrounded by nothing but wilderness. The hike started smoothly. The trail was overgrown but manageable. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was filled with the earthy scent of damp soil and the occasional chirping of birds. I felt alive, energized by the challenge of navigating a path few had taken. Every step seemed to take me further from the worries of daily life. After about 3 hours, I reached a small clearing by a stream. It was perfect. The water was clear and cold, gurgling over rocks. The clearing was flat, with just enough sunlight to keep the spot from feeling claustrophobic. I set down my pack, pulled out my tent, and began setting up. The process was calming, almost meditative. The tent went up without a hitch, and soon I had a small fire going to boil water for a simple meal. The first signs of unease came as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The woods, which had felt inviting and serene during the day, now seemed to close in around me. Shadows stretched longer, and the sounds of the forest changed. Birds were replaced by the rustling of unseen creatures. I told myself it was just the natural shift of the forest at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After dinner, I sat by the fire, enjoying its warmth and light. I had brought a book, but my eyes kept darting to the edge of the clearing. The fire's glow seemed to create a barrier between me and the encroaching darkness. I reminded myself that I was alone out here. No one knew about this spot but me. That thought was both comforting and unsettling. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent. The thin walls felt inadequate against the vastness of the forest. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I tried to rationalize it: deer, raccoons, maybe even a fox. Still, my body remained tense, every muscle ready to spring into action. Sometime during the night, I woke up. It wasn't a gradual stirring, but a sudden jolt, like my body knew something was wrong before my mind did. The fire had gone out, leaving the clearing in complete darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the trees. I held my breath, straining to hear whatever had woken me. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They weren't the quick, light steps of an animal, but the deliberate crunch of boots on the forest floor. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give me away. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. The steps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was stopped just outside my tent. I could hear them breathing, shallow and uneven. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker? Park ranger? But why would they be out here, miles off any marked trail, in the middle of the night? I reached for the small knife I kept in my pack, clutching it tightly. My other hand grabbed my phone. There was no signal, but the faint glow of the screen made me feel less alone. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The person outside didn't move. I could hear the occasional rustle, like they were shifting their weight. My hand ached from gripping the knife so hard, but I didn't dare relax. Then, as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. I listened until the sound faded completely, replaced by the usual noises of the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn seeped into the tent, I packed up as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me. The forest, which had felt so alive and welcoming the day before, now seemed oppressive, every shadow a potential threat. The hike back to my car was the longest 6 miles of my life. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. I tried to move quickly but carefully, not wanting to draw attention to myself. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. As I reached the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The windows were fogged up, and there were smudges on the driver's side door, like someone had tried to open it. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. I threw my gear into the back seat, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods, which once felt like a sanctuary, now feel like a place I'll never return to. I've told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a fellow camper who stumbled upon my sight. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Whoever was out there that night wasn't lost. They knew exactly where I was. I've always loved camping. The idea of packing up the bare necessities and heading into the wilderness has always appealed to me. This particular trip, however, would leave me questioning that love forever. It started as a solo trip. I'd been working non-stop for months and needed a break from everything. The plan was simple: drive out to a national forest a few hours away, find a secluded spot, and spend a few days surrounded by nature. I wanted quiet, no phones, no emails, just the sounds of the forest. I'd done similar trips before, so I wasn't worried about being alone. In fact, I looked forward to it. I chose a spot deep in the forest, well off the beaten path. The drive was long and winding, and as I got farther from civilization, the roads became narrower and bumpier. Eventually, I reached the end of the dirt road and parked my car. From there, I hiked about 3 miles into the woods to a clearing I'd found on a map. It was perfect, flat ground, surrounded by tall trees, and close to a small creek. I set up my tent, built a fire pit, and settled in for the evening. The first night was uneventful. I cooked dinner over the fire, read a book by flashlight, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The occasional rustle in the bushes or distant howl of a coyote didn't bother me. These were normal forest sounds, and I found them comforting. I fell asleep easily, the cool air and soft sounds lulling me into a deep sleep. The next day, I spent my time exploring the area. I followed the creek for a while, discovering a small waterfall and a grove of ancient trees that felt untouched by time. I took photos, sketched in my notebook, and enjoyed the solitude. By late afternoon, I returned to camp, tired but content. I made another fire, cooked a simple meal, and watched the stars come out. That's when things started to feel off. It began subtly. As I sat by the fire, I had the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I'd glance up from the flames, scanning the dark forest, but saw nothing. The sounds of the forest, once soothing, now felt oppressive. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves seemed amplified, sharper. I told myself it was just my imagination, a natural response to being alone in the dark. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I decided to call it a night, hoping that sleep would reset my nerves. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped myself in. The warmth of my sleeping bag was comforting, and I closed my eyes, determined to ignore the unease. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. The forest outside seemed unusually quiet now. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves, like footsteps. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps were too deliberate, too measured. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was didn't seem to care about being quiet. I debated what to do. Should I call out? Grab the knife I'd packed? Stay silent and hope they went away? My mind raced through every possibility. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every shadow cast by the moonlight, kept me on edge. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, half expecting to find tracks or some sign of a visitor. But there was nothing. The ground around my tent was undisturbed, the forest as still as ever. I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe my imagination had exaggerated the situation. After all, I was alone in the woods, and it was easy to let fear take over. Determined not to let it ruin my trip, I decided to stay another night. The day passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. I stuck close to camp, keeping my knife within reach. As night fell, I built a larger fire than usual, hoping the light and warmth would keep my nerves at bay. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. I sat frozen by the fire, the knife clutched in my hand. The footsteps didn't circle the camp this time. They came straight toward me. I stood up, my heart racing, and shone my flashlight into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty forest. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The footsteps stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, scanning the trees, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I retreated to my tent, knife still in hand. I didn't bother trying to sleep. I just sat there listening, waiting. As dawn approached, I made a decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt different now, hostile. Every sound, every shadow put me on edge. The hike back to my car was nerve-wracking. I moved as quickly as I could, the weight of my pack making the trek exhausting. The narrow trail seemed to stretch on forever. Every so often, I'd hear something behind me. A branch snapping, leaves rustling. I'd spin around, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. When I finally reached my car, I practically threw my gear into the back seat and jumped in. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. It was quick, just a flash of movement in the trees. Too fast to make out, but enough to send my heart racing. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The whole drive home, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone or something behind me. It's been weeks since that trip, and I still can't explain what happened. I've told myself it was just paranoia, that the footsteps were an animal and the movement in the trees was my imagination. But deep down, I'm not so sure. I haven't been camping since. The idea of being alone in the woods, miles from help, doesn't appeal to me anymore. Maybe one day I'll go back, but for now, I'm staying close to home. The forest may be beautiful, but it's also vast and full of secrets, and some secrets are better left undiscovered. It was late October when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had been working long hours for weeks, and the stress was starting to weigh me down. I figured a few days in the wilderness would clear my head. I picked a spot in the Adirondacks, a place I had visited once before but never truly explored. The trail I chose wasn't too remote, but it wasn't exactly popular either. It was the perfect mix of seclusion and accessibility, or so I thought. The drive to the trailhead took about 5 hours. I had packed everything the night before: my tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, a couple of freeze-dried meals, water bottles, a first aid kit, and a small knife. I also carried a detailed map of the area, even though I had a GPS on my phone. I've always believed in being prepared, and out here, where cell service could disappear at any moment, having a map felt essential. The first day went smoothly. I hiked about 7 miles into the woods, following a narrow trail that wound its way through thick trees and over small streams. The air was crisp, with that unmistakable scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of animals in the underbrush, but I never saw anything bigger than a squirrel. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing by a lake and decided to set up camp there. The lake was stunning, its surface like glass reflecting the fiery colors of autumn. Felt like I had the entire wilderness to myself. After pitching my tent and gathering some firewood, I spent the evening relaxing by the water. I made a simple dinner, watched the sun set, and listened to the distant hoot of an owl. When the stars came out, they were so bright it felt like I could reach up and touch them. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. The second day started off just as well. I woke up early, boiled some water for coffee, and planned my route for the day. I wanted to explore further up the trail, where the map showed a small ridge that promised a great view of the surrounding valleys. I packed a day's worth of supplies and set off, leaving my tent and most of my gear behind. The hike to the ridge was challenging but rewarding. The view was everything I'd hoped for. Rolling hills blanketed in fall colors, with distant mountains rising against a clear blue sky. I stayed there for over an hour, just taking it all in. On my way back to camp, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. The woods seemed quieter than they had been earlier. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just spooking myself because I was alone. But then I noticed the footprints. They were in the dirt along the trail, overlapping my own from earlier that morning. At first, I thought they might be mine, but they were too fresh. Someone else had been here, walking the same path as me. The prints were larger than mine, and the tread pattern didn't match my boots. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anyone. The forest was dense, and whoever it was could have easily stepped off the trail and disappeared into the trees. I felt a prickle of unease, but tried to brush it off. This was public land, after all. It wasn't unusual for other hikers to be in the area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to camp before it got too late. When I arrived, everything seemed normal at first. My tent was still there, and my gear appeared untouched. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The firewood I had gathered the night before was scattered around the clearing, as if someone had kicked it. My food bag, which I had hung from a tree to keep it safe from animals, was lying on the ground. The rope I'd used to tie it was cleanly cut. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into my camp, but the clean cut on the rope didn't make sense. Animals might chew through a rope, but they wouldn't leave a cut like that. Someone had been here. A wave of unease washed over me. I looked around the clearing, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The shadows were long now, and the forest seemed darker than it should have been. I told myself to stay calm. Whoever it was, they were probably long gone. Maybe it was just a curious hiker who thought my camp was abandoned. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to make a small fire to boost my morale and keep me busy. As the flames grew, the clearing felt a little less menacing. I ate a quick dinner, keeping my back to the fire and my eyes on the trees. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. When the fire started to die down, I reluctantly crawled into my tent, leaving my knife within easy reach. That night was restless. Every noise outside seemed amplified in the stillness. I thought I heard footsteps at one point, but when I peeked out of the tent, there was nothing there. I barely slept, and by the time dawn broke, I had made up my mind to cut my trip short. Whatever sense of peace I'd felt was gone, replaced by a growing unease. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the clearing and put some distance between myself and whatever or whoever had been lurking around. The trail back to the car was about 7 miles, and I figured I could make it in a few hours if I kept a steady pace. The first couple of miles were uneventful, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest was still unnervingly quiet, and my own footsteps seemed too loud. I tried to focus on the trail, on the way the sun filtered through the trees, but my mind kept drifting back to the footprints and the cut rope. About halfway to the trailhead, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. A small pile of stones, carefully stacked in the middle of the trail. It hadn't been there when I hiked in. My first thought was that it was some kind of marker, but for what? I walked around it, careful not to disturb it, and kept moving. The unease in my chest grew heavier with each step. As I neared the last mile, I started hearing noises again. This time, it was distinct. The sound of footsteps, coming from somewhere behind me. I stopped and turned, but the trail was empty. The footsteps stopped too. I stood there for a long moment, listening, but all I could hear was my own breathing. I started walking again, faster this time, and the footsteps started up again, keeping pace with me. They weren't loud, just a faint crunch of leaves, but they were there, By the time I reached the trailhead, I was almost running. My car was the only one in the small parking lot, and I felt a rush of relief as I unlocked the door and threw my pack inside. I didn't look back as I started the engine and pulled onto the gravel road. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally let myself breathe. Looking back, I'll never know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was just another hiker who didn't realize how much they were scaring me. Maybe it was someone with less innocent intentions. Either way, I've never gone camping alone again. The woods might be beautiful, but they're also vast and indifferent. And out there, you're truly on your own. I've always loved camping. The simplicity of it, the quiet escape from my busy life, the idea of being surrounded by nature with no cell service and no distractions had always been a dream for me. So, when I had a week off work last summer, I decided to spend it camping alone in a remote area of Vermont. Growing up there, I had a good sense of the woods and felt comfortable being out on my own. The spot I chose was a small clearing by a lake, about 10 miles from the nearest road. The only way to get there was by hiking, which suited me just fine. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the kind where you'd have to brush past branches and duck under low-hanging limbs. It wasn't a popular trail, which made it perfect for some solitude. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, plenty of food, water, and my trusty knife. I had a map of the area and a compass, though I barely used them since I'd been here before as a kid. The hike in was uneventful but tiring. The trail climbed steadily, and the afternoon sun beat down through the trees. Sweat soaked my shirt, and I stopped frequently to sip from my water bottle. I reached the clearing by late afternoon. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, and the surrounding forest was dense and green. It was exactly as I remembered. I set up my tent a few feet from the water, on a patch of flat, dry ground. After that, I gathered some firewood and built a small fire pit. I felt proud of my work. Everything was perfect. I spent the evening cooking a simple meal over the fire and watching the sun set over the lake. The colors in the sky turned from orange to pink to deep purple, and eventually the stars came out. Without light pollution, the sky was dazzling. That first night, I slept deeply, lulled by the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. The morning was peaceful. I made coffee on my little stove and spent a few hours fishing by the lake. I didn't catch much, but it didn't matter. I was enjoying the quiet. Around midday, I decided to explore the area. I followed a small stream that fed into the lake, curious to see where it led. The forest was dense, and I had to push through thick underbrush. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. A series of deep grooves in the bark of a tree. They looked like claw marks, but they were too high up to have been made by any animal I knew of. Black bears weren't uncommon in the area, but these marks were higher and wider than anything I'd ever seen. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably an old mark that had grown with the tree. But as I walked further, I started seeing more of them. They weren't everywhere, but they appeared often enough to make me uneasy. By the time I decided to turn back, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. I realized I'd wandered farther than I intended, and the thought of navigating back through the thick brush in the fading light made my chest tighten. When I finally broke through the undergrowth and saw the lake again, relief washed over me. But that relief was short-lived. As I approached my campsite, something felt wrong. The fire pit I'd built had been scattered, the stones tossed aside like toys. My tent was still there, but the flap was open, and my belongings were strewn around. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into my camp. Bears were known to raid campsites if food wasn't stored properly, but I had hung my food bag high in a tree, far from the tent, and it was untouched. Everything else, my clothes, my sleeping bag, my cooking gear, was scattered across the ground, as if someone had rifled through it. The unease I'd felt earlier came back stronger. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it must have been an animal. I spent the next hour cleaning up and setting things back in order. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves outside the tent made me sit up and listen. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of an animal, but the slow, deliberate crunch of boots on dry leaves. They circled the tent, stopping and starting, as if whoever it was knew I was inside. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped my knife tightly. I didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps eventually faded, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped out cautiously. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I decided then that I'd had enough. The solitude I'd been craving was no longer appealing. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, double-checking that I hadn't left anything behind. The hike back was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me jump, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. The trail, which had felt so familiar on the way in, now seemed alien and threatening. I kept imagining someone following me, just out of sight. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted. The relief I felt as I locked the doors and started the engine was overwhelming. As I drove away, I couldn't help but think about the claw marks, the disturbed camp, the footsteps. I still don't know what happened out there, and maybe I never will. But one thing is certain, I won't be camping alone again. I never thought a solo camping trip would leave me questioning my love for the outdoors. I had always found peace in the quiet of the woods, away from the noise of daily life. That weekend, I had decided to head out to a remote area I'd heard about from a friend, a hidden gem deep in the mountains, far from any well-trodden trails. It was supposed to be a place untouched by the crowds, where I could truly feel alone with nature. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, though the last stretch of dirt road had my car rattling and bouncing like it might fall apart. When I finally parked and stepped out, the air smelled like pine and damp earth. The trail wasn't marked, but I had a detailed map and GPS coordinates. My plan was to hike about 10 miles to a small lake and camp there for 2 nights before heading back. It seemed simple enough. The first few miles were beautiful. The trail wound through dense forest, the kind where sunlight filters down in golden streaks. I could hear birds chirping and the occasional rustle of squirrels darting through the underbrush. Everything felt serene, but as the hours passed and I got deeper into the woods, the sense of isolation began to settle in. The trail became harder to follow, with overgrown bushes and fallen trees blocking the way. Still, I pressed on, checking my map frequently to make sure I was on track. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The water was crystal clear, surrounded by tall evergreens and rocky outcrops. It was breathtaking, exactly what I had hoped for. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground near the shore, made a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. As darkness fell, the world around me grew silent except for the occasional croak of a frog or the distant hoot of an owl. I felt a sense of calm wash over me. That night, I woke up abruptly. It was pitch black outside, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I didn't know what had woken me up, but my heart was pounding. Lying there in the darkness, I strained my ears, but there was nothing unusual. After a while, I convinced myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place making me jumpy and drifted back to sleep. The next day, I spent my time exploring the area around the lake. There were no signs of other people, no old fire pits or discarded trash. It was like I had stepped into a part of the world no one else had touched. I fished for a bit, took photos, and even tried sketching the landscape, though I'm no artist. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather, and the wind picked up. I decided to head back to my camp to secure everything before the rain hit. As I approached my tent, I froze. Something was off. The tent flap was open, and my belongings were scattered. My first thought was animals, maybe a bear or raccoons, but nothing was torn or chewed. It looked more like someone had rummaged through my stuff. My food bag, which I had hung from a tree to keep it safe, was untouched. My stomach churned as I tried to make sense of it. I spent the next hour meticulously checking my gear and surroundings. There were no tracks, no signs of anyone or anything having been there. I told myself I must have left the tent open and the wind had blown things around, even though I knew that didn't make sense. The unease lingered, but I tried to shake it off. After all, I was miles from the nearest road, and it wasn't like anyone could just stumble upon this place. That night, the rain came down hard. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and flashes of lightning lit up the tent. I lay awake, listening to the storm, when I heard it again, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but it was there. The crunch of footsteps on wet ground. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rain-soaked trees and bushes. Nothing moved. I waited, my hand trembling, but the footsteps didn't come again. After a long while, I zipped the tent back up and lay there, every muscle in my body tense. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent to find the ground around my campsite disturbed. The muddy soil bore marks that could have been footprints, but the rain had smudged them into unrecognizable shapes. I packed up my gear quickly, deciding to cut my trip short. The thought of spending another night out there made my skin crawl. As I retraced my route back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and look over my shoulder, but the forest was empty. The sense of isolation that had been so appealing at first now felt oppressive. My heart raced every time a branch snapped or leaves rustled in the wind. About halfway back, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small, makeshift shelter, barely noticeable among the trees. It was nothing more than a few branches leaned against a fallen log, but inside were signs of recent use. A torn piece of fabric, an empty can of beans, and what looked like a crudely whittled stick. It was clear someone had been staying there, not far from where I had camped. I didn't linger. Picking up my pace, I focused on getting back to my car as quickly as possible. The last few miles felt like they stretched on forever, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, relief washed over me. I threw my gear in the trunk and didn't look back as I drove away. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about that trip. Who or what was out there with me? Was it just a coincidence that someone had been camping so close to me in such a remote place, or had they been watching me the whole time? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. I'll think twice before heading into the wilderness alone again. Camping had always been my way of reconnecting with myself. The quiet, the fresh air, and the simplicity of life under the stars were all I needed to reset. This time, I decided to head out to the dense wilderness of northern Maine. The area was remote, no cell service, no marked trails, and miles away from the nearest town. Just the way I liked it. I had planned meticulously for the trip. My backpack was loaded with all the essentials. Food for 4 days, a tent, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, and a small camping stove. I even carried a detailed topographic map and a compass just in case. I was confident in my skills. I had done trips like this before and prided myself on being able to handle whatever nature threw my way. I parked my car at the trailhead just before noon, locked it up, and started walking. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like a faint path worn by wildlife. The thick canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I felt the familiar excitement bubbling up as I ventured deeper into the wild. After about 6 miles, I reached a small clearing near a stream. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. The stream was crystal clear and flowing steadily, which meant I had a reliable water source. I pitched my tent, unpacked my gear, and started gathering firewood. The evening went smoothly. I cooked some dehydrated chili, read a few chapters of my book by the fire, and finally crawled into my tent as the temperature began to drop. The first night was uneventful, aside from the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I slept well and woke up early, ready to explore. After breakfast, I decided to hike further into the woods, leaving my tent and gear behind. I had my map, compass, and a day pack with water and snacks. The plan was to loop around and be back by mid-afternoon. The deeper I went, the denser the forest became. The towering trees seemed to close in, and the underbrush grew thicker. I found animal tracks, deer, rabbits, even what looked like bear prints. I made a mental note to stay alert. As I continued, I stumbled upon a peculiar sight, an old, overgrown logging road. It wasn't marked on my map, which intrigued me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it for a bit. The road was rough and uneven, with weeds and saplings reclaiming the space. After about an hour, I came across the remnants of what appeared to be an old cabin. It was in ruins, with moss-covered wooden beams and a collapsed roof. I paused to examine it, wondering who might have lived here and why they had left. It felt eerie but also fascinating, like I had stumbled upon a forgotten piece of history. I moved on, deciding it was time to loop back toward my campsite. That's when I noticed something unsettling. The shadows were longer than they should have been. The sun had dipped lower in the sky than I expected. I checked my watch and realized it was already late afternoon. Somehow I had lost track of time. I quickened my pace, navigating through the dense forest. But the more I walked, the less familiar everything seemed. I double-checked my map and compass. According to them, I should have been heading in the right direction. But the terrain didn't match what the map indicated. Panic began to creep in as I realized I might be lost. I tried to stay calm and retrace my steps, but the forest was a labyrinth of identical trees and undergrowth. Every direction looked the same. The sun was sinking fast, and with it, the temperature. I needed to find shelter. After wandering for what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a rocky outcrop. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the wind. I gathered branches and leaves to create a makeshift bed and settled in for the night. That night was different. The usual sounds of the forest were absent. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, no hooting owls. Just an oppressive silence that pressed down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. I clutched my knife tightly, my only real defense against whatever might be out there. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. I resumed my search for the campsite, determined to find my way back. But as the hours dragged on, I began to notice strange things. Broken branches that seemed too high up to be from any animal. Large patches of flattened grass, as if something heavy had been lying there. And then there were the footprints. They were human, but larger than any I'd ever seen, and they followed no discernible path. By the third day, My food and water were running low. The stream I had relied on was nowhere to be found. My energy was dwindling, and my nerves were frayed. I tried to keep moving, but my pace slowed as exhaustion set in. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl but deeper and more resonant. My heart raced as I froze in place, straining to pinpoint the direction it had come from. The sound didn't repeat, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. I pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last. Just as I began to lose hope, I caught sight of something through the trees. A faint plume of smoke. It was distant but unmistakable. Summoning every ounce of strength, I headed toward it. As I got closer, the smoke became more visible, and I could smell the faint aroma of burning wood. Relief washed over me. It had to be a campfire. What I found, however, was not what I expected. It was another campsite, but it was abandoned. The fire was smoldering, as if it had been recently extinguished. There were signs of activity, a tent, a cooking pot, even a backpack, but no people. It was as if whoever had been here had vanished without a trace. I searched the site for anything useful and found a half-full bottle of water and a granola bar. They felt like treasures at that moment. As night fell again, I decided to stay at the abandoned campsite. I rebuilt the fire, hoping its light and warmth would keep whatever was out there at bay. Sleep was impossible. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the firelight, but when I blinked, it was gone. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stay there. I packed up what little I had and kept moving. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was clouded by fatigue and dehydration. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I heard a sound that filled me with hope, the distant hum of an engine. I followed the sound, stumbling through the underbrush until I emerged onto another logging road. This one was more defined, with tire tracks that looked fresh. I started walking along it, praying it would lead me to safety. After what felt like hours, I saw a pickup truck coming toward me. I waved frantically, and the driver stopped. He was a local hunter who had been out checking his traps. When I told him what had happened, he looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief. He gave me water and a ride back to civilization. As we drove, I glanced back at the forest, its dense canopy hiding the secrets it had nearly claimed me for. I never found my original campsite or figured out what had been stalking me. But one thing was clear. I had underestimated the wilderness and the unnerving feeling that something out there had been watching me the entire time. The sound of gravel crunching under my tires faded as I drove deeper into the forest. My plan was simple: escape the noise of the city for a weekend and enjoy the peace that only a remote campsite could offer. I had found a spot online, a small clearing near a quiet lake, miles away from any marked trails. It seemed perfect, isolated, serene, and untouched by crowds. After parking my car at the edge of the forest, I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders and began the hike. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, a welcome contrast to the exhaust fumes and pavement I had left behind. My gear felt heavier with each step, but the thought of the tranquil lake kept me moving. The trail was faint, more of a suggestion than a path. I had to rely on my GPS and the directions I'd memorized from the website. After an hour of hiking, the trees began to thin, and I caught my first glimpse of the water. The lake was small, almost perfectly round, with crystal clear water that reflected the sky like a mirror. The clearing was just big enough for my tent and a small fire pit. It was everything I'd hoped for: I set up my tent quickly, eager to relax before nightfall. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves as a squirrel darted by. Once the tent was pitched and my sleeping bag unrolled, I gathered some wood for a fire. The task was easy. The ground was littered with dry branches. By the time the sun dipped below the treetops, I had a small fire crackling away. I cooked a simple meal over the flames and ate while watching the lake. As darkness fell, the sounds of the forest changed. The birds quieted, replaced by the steady chorus of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The air grew cooler, and I wrapped myself in a jacket, leaning back against a log. The stars above were brighter than I'd ever seen them, unobscured by city lights. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace. That peace didn't last. It started with a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a faint rustling in the bushes behind my tent. I ignored it, convincing myself it was nothing. But then it came again, louder this time. It wasn't the random swish of leaves in the breeze. It was deliberate, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. I'd seen no signs of bears in the area, and I had stored my food in a sealed container far from my tent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest seemed too quiet now, as if the crickets and frogs had decided to hold their breath. After a few minutes, I forced myself to relax. I fed another log to the fire and sipped from my water bottle, trying to focus on the warmth of the flames and the beauty of the night sky. The rustling didn't come back, and I began to feel silly for being so jumpy. By the time I crawled into my tent, the fire had burned down to embers. I zipped the tent shut, slid into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. The ground beneath me was hard, but I was exhausted from the hike and drifted off quickly. I woke up to the sound of snapping branches. My eyes flew open, heart pounding. The noise was close, too close. I lay still, listening. The sound came again, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Whoever or whatever was out there was just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I reached for my flashlight, moving as quietly as possible. My fingers trembled as I switched it on. The beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent, but doing little to dispel the shadows outside. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps had stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, flashlight in hand, ears straining for any sound. The forest was silent again, but this time, the silence felt oppressive. I debated what to do. Should I call out, unzip the tent and look outside, or stay where I was and hope whatever was out there would move on? Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Gradually, my racing heart began to slow. I convinced myself it must have been an animal, perhaps a curious deer or a fox. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak and rustle outside made me tense up, waiting for the footsteps to return. The next morning, the forest felt different. The bright sunlight and chirping birds did little to erase the unease that had settled over me. As I stepped out of my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The ground around my campsite was disturbed. The soft dirt bore several footprints, human footprints. They were large, too large to be my own, and they circled my tent. I stood there, staring at the tracks, my mind racing. Someone had been here, watching me while I slept. The thought made my skin crawl. I scanned the clearing, looking for any other signs of intrusion. My food container was untouched, and nothing appeared to be missing, but the presence of those footprints was enough to set me on edge. I decided to pack up and leave. As much as I had looked forward to this trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that staying here was a bad idea. I stuffed my gear into my backpack doused the fire pit with water, and began the hike back to my car. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike out felt longer than the hike in. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me whip my head around, searching for the source. The forest that had seemed so inviting yesterday now felt menacing. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in time with my footsteps. When I finally reached my car, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I tossed my backpack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and began the drive back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened that night. I've thought about it endlessly, trying to make sense of the footprints and the sounds. Was it a prank? A coincidence? Or something more sinister? All I know is that I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I've always loved the quiet of the wilderness. That's why I chose a solo camping trip in the middle of the woods for my long weekend. I had been feeling burnt out from work and needed to clear my head. The idea of disconnecting from my phone and the stress of daily life felt like the perfect solution. I picked a spot about 2 hours from my town, a dense forest with a hiking trail that wasn't too popular. It was the kind of place where you could go an entire day without seeing another soul. Perfect, I thought. I spent the week preparing. My backpack was packed with everything I thought I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, water bottles, a small stove, a flashlight, extra batteries, a map, and a compass. I even packed a first aid kit just in case. I wasn't inexperienced. I'd done solo camping trips before, though not for a few years. Still, I felt confident. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The parking lot was empty except for one other car. That didn't bother me. The fewer people around, the better. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear. A perfect day to start my hike. I locked my car, hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders, and set off down the trail. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through tall pines and thick underbrush, the ground covered in a soft layer of fallen needles. I kept an eye on the map, making sure I was heading toward the area I'd chosen to set up camp. The quiet was calming, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I stopped for a quick lunch around noon, sitting on a fallen log and enjoying the peace. Everything felt perfect. I reached my chosen campsite by mid-afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by trees, far enough from the trail to feel secluded but close enough that I could find my way back easily. I set up my tent and gathered some firewood. By the time the sun started to set, I had a small fire crackling and a hot meal cooking on my little stove. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the forest settle into its nighttime rhythm. The temperature dropped as darkness fell, but the fire kept me warm. I felt at peace. The first night passed without incident. I slept well, waking up early to the sound of birds chirping. After a quick breakfast, I decided to spend the day exploring the area. I left my tent and most of my gear behind, taking only a small day pack with some essentials. I marked my campsite on the map to make sure I could find my way back. The day was sunny but cool, perfect for hiking. As I wandered, I found myself marveling at the beauty of the forest. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I spotted a deer in the distance and paused to watch it until it disappeared into the trees. Time seemed to slip away, and before I knew it, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. I decided to head back to my campsite, using the map and compass to guide me. That's when things started to feel off. At first, it was small things. The trail seemed less distinct than I remembered, and the landmarks I'd noted earlier didn't look quite right. I told myself it was just my imagination. I'd been walking all day, and maybe I was more tired than I realized. But as the sun sank lower and the shadows grew longer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going the wrong way. I stopped to check the map again, trying to pinpoint my location. According to the map, I should have been close to my campsite, but nothing around me looked familiar. The trees seemed denser, the underbrush thicker. I decided to backtrack, hoping to find something I recognized. As I turned around, I noticed how quiet it had become. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls were gone. The silence was oppressive, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I kept walking, trying to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help me find my way back, but the more I walked, the more disoriented I felt. It was as if the forest had shifted around me, the familiar paths and landmarks replaced by an endless maze of trees. I pulled out my flashlight as the last light of day faded. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't make me feel any less vulnerable. Every shadow seemed to move, and every rustle made me jump. Eventually, I realized I wasn't going to find my campsite before nightfall. I needed to stop and make a temporary shelter. I found a spot under a large tree, cleared away some leaves, and sat down to assess my situation. I still had some water and snacks in my day pack, along with a small emergency blanket. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I wrapped myself in the blanket and tried to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind was racing, going over every mistake I might have made to end up here. The night was long and cold. I thought I heard footsteps at one point, but when I shone my flashlight around, there was nothing there. It was probably just an animal, I told myself, though the thought didn't bring much comfort. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted but determined to find my way back. I started walking as soon as there was enough light to see. My plan was to keep heading in one direction until I hit the trail or another recognizable landmark. Hours passed, and I began to doubt myself again. The forest seemed endless, each tree blending into the next. My water was running low, and I hadn't seen any streams or sources to refill it. My stomach growled, but I forced myself to keep moving. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon something that made my heart leap. An old, overgrown trail. It wasn't the one I'd come in on, but it was a trail nonetheless. I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me to a road or a campsite. The trail was narrow and uneven, clearly not well used, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. As I followed the trail, I noticed signs of human activity. A rusted tin can here, a weathered piece of rope there. It gave me hope that I was getting closer to civilization. But then I found something that made my stomach drop. An old campsite. The remains of a fire pit were surrounded by debris. A torn backpack, a shattered water bottle, and a pair of boots, one of them partially buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. I felt a chill run down my spine. What had happened here? I didn't want to stick around to find out. I kept moving, my pace quickening despite my exhaustion. The trail grew steeper, winding up a hill. By the time I reached the top, the sun was starting to set again. From the hilltop, I could see a break in the trees that looked like a clearing. With renewed determination, I headed toward it. The clearing turned out to be a small meadow, and on the far side, I spotted a dirt road. Relief washed over me. A road meant I was finally back in familiar territory, or at least close to it. I followed the road until I came across a sign pointing toward a ranger station. It was a few miles away, but I didn't care. I finally found my way out. By the time I reached the ranger station, it was fully dark. The ranger on duty looked surprised to see me and immediately offered water and food. I explained what had happened, and they assured me I wasn't the first person to get lost in those woods. They gave me a ride back to the trailhead, where my car was still parked. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the abandoned campsite and the eerie silence of the forest. I'd gone into the woods seeking peace and solitude, but I came out with a deep respect for how unforgiving nature can be. I haven't been on a solo camping trip since. I always loved camping. The sense of being away from the grind of everyday life, surrounded by nothing but nature, was something I craved whenever work got too overwhelming. This time, I decided to go solo. I had camped alone before and always found it to be peaceful, a way to reset my mind. I chose a remote area in the Adirondacks, a place I'd visited briefly years ago but hadn't fully explored. It seemed perfect. Dense forests, clear lakes, and miles of trails where I could hike without encountering another soul. I arrived early on a Friday morning. The drive itself took nearly 6 hours, but it was worth it. The trailhead parking lot was empty, as I had hoped. I hoisted my backpack, adjusted the straps, and set off into the woods. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustling of leaves as squirrels darted away. Felt perfect. Exactly what I needed. The hike to the campsite I had picked out was about 8 miles. The trail was narrow, winding through towering pines and overgrown shrubs. Occasionally, I had to duck under fallen branches or step over roots that jutted out like nature's tripwires. I kept my pace steady, stopping only briefly to sip water or adjust my gear. By midday, I reached a small clearing near a lake. The water was calm, reflecting the cloudless sky like a mirror. I decided this would be my home for the next 2 nights. I set up my tent a few yards from the shore, far enough to avoid morning dew but close enough to enjoy the view. I gathered some firewood, stacking it neatly next to a ring of rocks I assembled for a fire pit. By late afternoon, everything was ready. My tent was pitched, my sleeping bag unrolled, and my food supply hung from a high branch to keep it safe from bears. I felt accomplished and settled in for an evening of relaxation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a fire and cooked a simple meal: rice and dehydrated vegetables. The warmth of the flames felt comforting against the growing chill of the night. Stars began to appear, dotting the sky in a way you can only see far from city lights. It was beautiful. I leaned back against a log, letting the peace of the moment wash over me. The first night passed without incident. I woke early, feeling refreshed. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed a faint trail that led deeper into the woods, away from the lake. The trees grew denser and the underbrush thicker, but I enjoyed the challenge. I came across signs of wildlife: tracks in the dirt, claw marks on a tree, and even a pile of scat that I assumed belonged to a bear. It reminded me to stay alert, but I wasn't too concerned. I'd taken all the necessary precautions. Around midday, I stumbled upon something odd. It was a small clearing, much like the one I had set up camp in, but this one felt different. The grass was flattened in places, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. A rusted can lay half buried in the dirt, and nearby, I spotted a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was faded and frayed, but it looked like it had once been part of a jacket. I felt a slight unease but brushed it off. People camped out here all the time. Maybe someone had left in a hurry or abandoned old gear. I returned to my campsite by mid-afternoon, tired but satisfied with my exploration. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I cooked another simple meal, watched the sunset, and settled in for my second night. That's when things started to feel off. It was the sound that woke me. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, steady rustling that seemed to come from all around. But as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't the wind. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, crunching softly on the forest floor. My heart started to race. I sat up, straining to hear more clearly. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I began to relax, they started again, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the switch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of my tent and the immediate area outside. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the sound persisted. It was coming from the direction of the lake. I debated whether to investigate or stay put. Part of me wanted to unzip the tent and shine my light into the woods, but another part, the smarter part, told me to stay inside. I grabbed the small knife I always kept in my pack and held it tightly. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. Morning came as a relief. The sunlight made everything feel safer, less threatening. I stepped out of my tent and looked around. There were no signs of anything unusual, no tracks, no disturbances in the dirt. I convinced myself it had been an animal. A deer, maybe. They could move quietly but also make enough noise to sound human if you weren't expecting it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my gear, making sure to leave the campsite as clean as I'd found it. By mid-morning, I was back on the trail, heading toward my car. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief. My car was just as I'd left it, and there were no other vehicles around. I loaded my gear into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I started the engine and pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the trees, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. I didn't stop driving until I reached home. That night, as I lay in my bed, the events of the trip replayed in my mind. I kept telling myself it had been an animal or maybe my imagination. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched. That somewhere, deep in those woods, someone had been there with me. Weeks later, I came across an article online about missing hikers in the Adirondacks. The details were vague, but the locations mentioned were close to where I had camped. Sent a chill down my spine. I haven't been camping since. I've always loved the quiet of the woods. There's something peaceful about being surrounded by nothing but trees, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional call of a bird. It's a kind of silence that makes you feel alone, but in a good way. At least that's how I used to think. Last year, I planned a solo camping trip to a remote forest area, and it turned out to be an experience I'll never forget. The trip was supposed to be a break from my routine. My job was wearing me down, and I needed an escape. I'd done solo camping before, but this time I wanted to push myself. I picked a location deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road or trail. It was a spot I'd found on a map, a small clearing by a creek. There were no marked trails leading there, and it seemed perfect for the solitude I craved. I spent weeks preparing. I checked my gear multiple times, packed enough food for 3 days, and made sure my phone was fully charged. I even carried a small power bank, though I doubted I'd get any signal out there. My backpack was heavy, loaded with essentials like a first aid kit, a map, a compass, and a sturdy tent. I felt ready for anything. The hike to the campsite took most of the day. The trail started easy, but as I ventured deeper into the forest, it became less defined. I had to rely on my map and compass to navigate, which added to the sense of adventure. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air felt cooler, and the forest floor was soft with moss and fallen leaves. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that makes you forget the outside world exists. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was just as I'd imagined. a small patch of grass surrounded by towering trees, with a creek running along one side. The water was clear and cold, and I could hear its gentle flow as I set up my tent. Everything felt perfect. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, then sat by the creek, watching the stars. The night sky was incredible, free from the light pollution of the city. The forest was alive with sounds: crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I felt at peace. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I didn't go far, just wandered around the clearing and along the creek. I found some animal tracks near the water, deer, I assumed. There was also a faint trail leading deeper into the woods, but I decided against following it. I didn't want to risk getting lost. Instead, I spent the day relaxing by the creek, reading a book, and enjoying the quiet. Things started to feel off that evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to grow darker and quieter than the night before. The usual sounds of wildlife were missing, replaced by an uneasy silence. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. But as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I brought a small flashlight, and I used it to scan the trees around the clearing. Nothing, just shadows and branches. Still, the feeling persisted. I decided to turn in early, hoping a good night's sleep would calm my nerves. Didn't. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside my tent. It was faint, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light revealed nothing but the clearing and the trees beyond. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a deer, and tried to go back to sleep. But the sounds continued, sporadic and unsettling. I stayed awake for hours, clutching the flashlight and straining to hear anything that might explain the noises. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. The next day, I felt on edge. I couldn't stop thinking about the sounds from the night before. I decided to stay close to the campsite, not wanting to venture too far into the woods. I spent most of the day gathering firewood and making sure my gear was in order. By evening, I'd convinced myself that I was overreacting. After all, I was in the wilderness. Strange noises were to be expected. That night, the sounds returned, louder and more persistent. It wasn't just rustling this time. I heard twigs snapping and something heavy moving through the underbrush. My stomach sank. Whatever it was big. Too big to be a raccoon or a deer. I stayed in my tent, clutching my flashlight and a small camping knife. I knew the knife wouldn't do much against a bear or any other large animal, but it was better than nothing. The sounds grew closer, circling the clearing. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a bear? A mountain lion? Or something worse, a person? The thought of another person out there watching me was more terrifying than any animal. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the tent, listening to the sounds and praying they would stop. Eventually, just before dawn, they did. When daylight came, I packed up my gear. I'd had enough. The idea of spending another night out there was unbearable. I decided to cut my trip short and head back. But as I took down my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt around the clearing. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I've been right. Someone had been out there, walking around my campsite in the middle of the night. The tracks circled the clearing, coming alarmingly close to my tent. My hands shook as I finished packing. I felt exposed and vulnerable, like whoever had been out there was still watching me. The hike back was a blur. I moved as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I felt like I was being followed, though I never saw anyone. By the time I reached the trailhead and my car, I was exhausted and relieved beyond words. I never reported what happened. What would I say? That I heard noises and found footprints? It wasn't exactly a crime, but the experience changed me. I haven't been camping since. The woods no longer feel peaceful. Instead, they remind me of how vulnerable I was out there, alone and far from help. Whoever was out there that night, I hope I never meet them. Camping was supposed to be my way of escaping the noise of everyday life. I had always found peace in nature, with the sounds of rustling leaves, chirping birds, and the occasional distant call of an owl. This time, I had planned a solo trip to a secluded area deep in the national forest. The campsite wasn't marked on any official map, but it had been recommended by an old hiking buddy who assured me it was quiet and remote. I set out early on a crisp autumn morning. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected, with winding roads that seemed to twist endlessly through thick woods. When I finally parked, the area was completely empty. That's exactly what I wanted. No cars, no people, just me and the wilderness. I packed light but made sure to bring the essentials. A small tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, enough food for 3 days, and my trusty multi-tool. The trail leading to the site was unmarked, so I relied on my GPS and a printed map, just in case. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The trail was faint, barely visible in some spots, but I could see signs of old footprints and the occasional weathered marker on a tree trunk. I reached the campsite by mid-afternoon, a clearing surrounded by towering pines with a small stream running nearby. It was perfect. After setting up my tent and arranging my gear, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest felt alive, but not in an overwhelming way. It was quiet, almost serene, with only the sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As the sun began to dip below the treetops, I returned to my campsite to prepare dinner. The temperature dropped quickly, and I was grateful for the warm meal. I ate while watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange before fading into darkness. That night, I was reminded of just how dark the wilderness could get. Without any light pollution, the stars were brilliant, but the forest floor was pitch black. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the soothing sound of the stream. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was abrupt, like a switch flipping in my brain. At first, I thought it was just the unfamiliarity of sleeping outside alone, but then I realized there was a new sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, straining my ears. The sound stopped. I convinced myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, the forest felt different. The serenity I had felt the day before was replaced by a subtle tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. While boiling water for coffee, I noticed something strange. The ground near the edge of the clearing looked disturbed. Upon closer inspection, I saw what appeared to be footprints, but they were odd. They weren't the neat prints of hiking boots or the soft imprints of animal paws. These were irregular, like someone had been dragging their feet. I've always considered myself a rational person, so I tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe someone had passed through the area before I arrived, or maybe I had made the prints myself without realizing. Still, the unease lingered. I decided to spend the day exploring farther from the campsite, hoping a good hike would clear my head. I followed the stream upstream, winding through dense forest and over rocky terrain. The farther I went, the more remote it felt. I didn't see another soul, not even wildlife, which struck me as odd. The forest was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound you make. By the time I returned to the campsite, the sun was beginning to set again. The footprints were still there, and they seemed fresher, as if someone had been there during the day. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing or out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That night, I built a small fire for comfort. The flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, and I found myself glancing into the darkness more often than I liked. The sound of the stream, once soothing, now felt like it was masking other noises. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. I told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my tent, listening to the forest. The footsteps returned, closer this time. They were slow, deliberate, and they stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps resumed, circling the tent before fading into the distance. I didn't move until the first light of dawn. The next morning, I made the decision to cut the trip short. As much as I loved the solitude of the forest, my gut was telling me it was time to leave. While packing up, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My movements felt mechanical, my senses heightened to every sound and shadow. The hike back to the trailhead was nerve-wracking. The forest, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt oppressive. The trail seemed longer, the trees closer together. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a local who didn't like outsiders? A hermit living off the grid? Or was my imagination running wild? When I finally reached my car, relief washed over me. I loaded my gear as quickly as possible and started the engine. The gravel road leading out of the forest felt endless, but as I left the trees behind, the tension began to ease. Back home, I couldn't stop thinking about the trip. I replayed every moment, trying to make sense of what had happened. The footsteps, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. None of it added up. I told a few friends about the experience, and while most chalked it up to an overactive imagination, one suggested it might have been a squatter or someone living illegally in the forest. That explanation made sense, but it didn't make the experience any less unsettling. I haven't been camping alone since. The forest still calls to me, but now I'm more cautious. I stick to established campsites and bring a friend whenever I can. Nature is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. Sometimes the things that scare us the most aren't the ones we can see, but the ones we can't. I decided to go camping alone for the weekend. It had been a rough couple of months at work, and I needed a break from everything. The constant buzzing of emails, the deadlines, and the crowded streets of the city. The forest, with its stillness and solitude, seemed like the perfect escape. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had everything I needed. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, enough food for 3 days, and a map of the area. My plan was to hike to a remote spot I'd read about online. A small clearing by a lake, miles away from any marked trails. The drive to the trailhead took most of the morning. By the time I parked my car and started hiking, it was already early afternoon. The trail began easy enough, winding gently through the trees, with patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy above. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and the occasional chirping of birds. The air smelled fresh, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm settling over me. After about an hour, I left the main trail and ventured onto an unmarked path that I had seen on my map. This was where the hike became more challenging. The ground was uneven, and fallen branches made the going slow. I stopped occasionally to check my compass and make sure I was heading in the right direction. By the time I reached the clearing by the lake, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water. The place was just as beautiful as I'd imagined. peaceful and untouched. There wasn't another soul in sight. I set up my tent close to the treeline, where the ground was flat and dry. After unrolling my sleeping bag and organizing my gear, I gathered some firewood and built a small fire near the lake's edge. As the flames flickered and danced, I cooked a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky. Sitting by the fire, watching the sun set over the water, I felt a rare sense of contentment. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself that this was exactly what I'd needed. Darkness fell quickly, and with it came a deep silence, the kind of silence you don't get in the city. It was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant croak of a frog. I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly behind me. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent's ceiling, I felt the weight of exhaustion pulling me towards sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. I lay still, listening. The forest outside was quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like something brushing against fabric. It was coming from outside the tent. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate for that. It was slow and methodical, like someone running their fingers along the side of the tent. I stayed frozen in place, my mind racing. Could it be an animal? A curious raccoon? Maybe, but raccoons didn't usually behave like this. I reached for the flashlight I'd left by my side and clicked it on. The beam of light illuminated the inside of the tent, but it didn't do much to calm my nerves. The sound stopped abruptly. For a long moment, I just lay there, gripping the flashlight, my ears straining for any hint of movement. When nothing happened, I told myself to calm down. It was probably nothing. I eventually drifted back to sleep, though it was fitful and uneasy. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. Everything seemed normal at first. The lake was calm, and the forest was bathed in the soft light of dawn. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were tracks in the dirt around my tent. Not animal tracks, but human footprints. They were fresh, the edges still sharp. Whoever had been out here must have been walking around my campsite while I slept. I felt a chill run down my spine. The clearing was miles away from any trail, and I hadn't seen another person since I started hiking. What were the chances that someone else had decided to camp in the exact same remote spot? And why hadn't they made themselves known? I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it could have been a lost hiker or even a ranger. But the thought lingered as I went about my morning routine. I decided to stay another night. Packing up and leaving felt like giving in to fear, and I didn't want to ruin the trip over what was probably nothing. I spent the day exploring the area around the lake, taking pictures and jotting down notes in my journal. By the time evening rolled around, I felt more relaxed. The footprints, I convinced myself, were just a coincidence. That night, I built another fire and cooked a simple dinner. As I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest around me felt different somehow, as if the trees were leaning in closer, their shadows stretching further. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light and my own nerves. But when I crawled into my tent that night, I kept the flashlight and a small knife within arm's reach. I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, it wasn't a sound that woke me, but a feeling. The kind of primal instinct that tells you something is wrong. I lay there, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it. Faint footsteps, moving slowly around the tent. Whoever it was, they were being careful, trying not to make noise. My mind raced through my options. Should I call out? Pretend I hadn't noticed? Or confront them outright? Before I could decide, the footsteps stopped. There was a long pause, and then something pressed against the side of the tent. It was a hand. I could see the outline clearly, the fingers splayed against the fabric. My blood ran cold. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The hand lingered for what felt like an eternity before it slowly withdrew. Then silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped outside. The campsite looked the same as before, but the footprints were back, circling the tent. This time, they were deeper, as if whoever had made them had been standing in place for a long time. That was it. I decided to pack up and leave. As quickly as I could, I broke down the tent, stuffed everything into my backpack, and started hiking back the way I'd come. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The hike back to the trailhead felt like it took twice as long as the hike in. By the time I reached my car, my legs were aching and my throat was dry. I threw my gear into the back seat and got behind the wheel, locking the doors before I even started the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. I never figured out who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just a curious hiker, or maybe it was someone with darker intentions. Either way, the experience left me shaken. I haven't been camping alone since. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now feels like a place full of unseen eyes and silent footsteps. The idea of spending a weekend deep in the wilderness had always been something I looked forward to. There was a kind of solitude out there that I couldn't find anywhere else. No traffic noise, no endless emails, no interruptions. Just me, the trees, the sky, and the sound of nature. So, when I finally got a free weekend, I packed up my gear and headed out to a remote area of the forest. It wasn't my first solo camping trip, but it turned out to be the most unforgettable one. I chose a location about 3 hours from my house, far enough away to feel isolated but not completely unreachable. The forest was dense, with towering pines and a thick underbrush that seemed to swallow sound. The trail I planned to follow wasn't well marked, but I had my map, a compass, and a GPS as a backup. I had learned to be prepared for anything out there. At least I thought I had. The hike in was uneventful, though the terrain was rougher than I had expected. The trail narrowed at points, forcing me to navigate through thorny bushes and over fallen logs. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. By the time I reached the spot I'd picked for my campsite, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the forest feel even more remote. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by trees, with just enough space to give me a view of the sky above. There was a small creek nearby, its gentle gurgling providing a soothing backdrop. After gathering some firewood and setting up a makeshift fire ring with rocks, I got a fire going and cooked a simple meal. The warmth of the flames and the satisfaction of a hot meal after a long hike made me feel at ease. It was the kind of peace I had been craving. As darkness settled over the forest, I climbed into my tent and zipped it shut. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint light that barely reached the edges of the clearing. I lay on my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the night. Crickets chirped, the creek bubbled, and occasionally, I'd hear the hoot of an owl. It wasn't long before I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. The forest outside was silent, almost unnaturally so. The usual night sounds were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. I checked my watch. It was just past 2 a.m. I lay still, straining my ears for any sound. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, a soft rustling sound coming from the direction of the creek. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the rustling didn't seem random. It was steady, deliberate, like footsteps. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the sound grew louder, closer. Reaching for my flashlight, I clicked it on and shone it towards the tent flap. The beam of light revealed nothing out of the ordinary inside the tent, but my pulse was racing. I debated whether to unzip the tent and shine the light outside. Part of me wanted to know what was out there, but another part of me wanted to stay hidden and hope whatever it was would go away. The sound stopped. For a moment, the silence was even more unsettling than the noise had been. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Then, a new sound broke the silence, a low, guttural grunt, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. This was no small animal. I forced myself to unzip the tent just enough to peer outside. The fire had long since gone out, leaving the clearing in near total darkness. I swept the flashlight beam across the trees but saw nothing. The sound had stopped again, but I could feel something. A presence. It's hard to explain, but I knew I wasn't alone. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, crouched in the tent with the flashlight in one hand and my camping knife in the other. The forest remained silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I must have dozed off, though my sleep was restless and filled with uneasy dreams. When I woke, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light through the trees. The feeling of dread from the night before had lessened, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. I stepped out of the tent, my legs stiff and my mind still foggy. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, but there was something off. The ground around the tent was disturbed, as if someone or something had been walking around it. The footprints were faint, but they were there, too large to be from any animal I'd expect to find in this area. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was my imagination or some perfectly logical explanation I hadn't thought of yet. I packed up my gear quickly, deciding to cut the trip short and head back. As much as I loved the solitude of the forest, the events of the night had left me unsettled. The hike back was uneventful at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I'd hear a sound, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, but every time I turned around, the trail was empty. The sense of unease grew stronger with each step, until I found myself practically jogging down the trail, desperate to reach my car. When I finally emerged from the forest and saw the parking area, relief washed over me. But as I approached my car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a long scratch running down the side of the car, deep enough to expose the metal beneath the paint. It hadn't been there when I parked. I'd have noticed. I didn't waste any time loading my gear and getting out of there. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who or what had been out there? And why had they been following me? Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened during that trip. I've been camping many times since then, but I've never gone back to that area. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the footprints around my tent and the scratch on my car, and I wonder if I'll ever find out the truth. But deep down, I'm not sure I want to.